Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight, and thank you to everybody that's also participating online. We understand that we have a full house. Unfortunately, there are limited facilities in town to hold meetings like that, so we can accommodate 140 people here and another 500 people online, and it does look like we've been able to accommodate everybody. It's a little cramped, but thank you for that. I'm Tom Terry. I'm the City Administrator for the City of Elko New Market. I will not be doing most of the talking tonight. That's going to be our consultants and staff that are experts in particular areas. But I would like to talk a little bit about the meeting tonight. The purpose tonight is to provide information to private well owners. So this is an informational meeting. There's no decisions being made tonight. There's no actions being taken tonight. This is purely an informational meeting. We're going to discuss potential interaction between city wells and private wells. As the city continues to grow, the city's going to use more and more water, and there is the potential for interaction between private wells based on the volume of water that's being pulled by city wells. And so we want to talk about that tonight. And this is not a required meeting. Nobody's making us do this. We're doing this proactively to make sure that we are communicating with everybody. There are some required notices that we'll be providing in the future, but we're doing this just to make sure that we stay ahead of the curve. So when you get a letter in the mail at some point down the road, you're not going, what is this and why am I getting it? So who is invited tonight? We mailed notices to all properties that potentially have a well within 2.5 miles of one of our production wells. As a city, we have 3 of them. The county records indicate that there was a building on the property, and that's the best indicator, and it's not served by municipal water, so you're not hooked up to the city's water system. That is the best indicator of any properties that are likely to have a well on them. Some of you may not have wells on your properties and got the notice. The reality is there are some well indexes out there that list wells, but it's been found that 30 to 50% of wells aren't in that record. And so this was our attempt to notify everybody that likely had any potential of having a well so that you could be informed. The map that I just put up shows that 2.5 mile boundary. If you look at the map, the dark dashed line is the current city boundary. All of the properties in lavender are properties that some portion of them touches that outer boundary of the 2.5 miles. So every parcel that met that criteria and touched that green line or was within it was mailed a notice for tonight. So what is our meeting format tonight? There's going to be a presentation, and I apologize, but there's going to be a lot of information that we are going to be providing tonight. So keep in mind a couple of things. One is the meeting tonight is being recorded, and we're going to post it on the city's website, and the location where you can get it is on the blue cards when you came in. That's going to be the city's website at the My Private Well page on the city's website. We expect the presentations to take approximately an hour, maybe a little more. After that, we'll be holding Q&A. We will devote up to an hour and a half for Q&A to answer the questions that we can answer. After that, we'll try and get done what we can. Staff will hang around for a little bit for those of you that don't want to ask questions in front of a large crowd. And then there's also an email address, which is on the blue cards, which by the sign-up sheets, that you can email any additional or future questions or concerns that you have to. I'd like to introduce the other staff that are here tonight that'll be taking part in the presentation or the process. I've already introduced myself. I'd like to introduce Rich Revering. He is the city engineer. He'll be providing a lot of the information tonight. Renee Christensen, she is our senior planner. She will also be providing part of the presentation tonight. I'd also like to point out Derek Kavanaugh from our Public Works Department. Derek, are you about? He's the guy in the fluorescent shirt running around, is probably doing this right now. Yeah. And then we have Zach Keller. Zach, could you come up and walk through the rooms? Zach is the young gentleman with the tie and the beard. Zach is our field coordinator, and a lot of the program stuff that Rich is going to be talking about, he's going to be our field contact and dealing with a lot of that. So, first part of the presentation, I'll turn over to Renee, and she'll talk about the growth plans for the City of Elko New Market.
Thank you, Tom. Again, I'm just going to provide a little information on how cities plan for growth. Most cities plan for growth through the adoption of a comprehensive plan. What is a comprehensive plan? It's a document that cities adopt that describe the community's vision for itself into the future. A comprehensive plan is a compilation of a city's policy statements, goals, values, maps that basically guide the future development of the city. Minnesota statutes give cities the authority to plan and manage land as a community grows and to establish these goals and values. And within the Twin Cities metropolitan area, not only does the state statute allow cities to adopt comprehensive plans, they actually require it and mandate it within the 7-county metropolitan area. So this is comprehensive plans are mandated upon the city of Elko New Market. The purpose of a comprehensive plan is to guide growth and development, to document goals and values, to serve as a communication device to the public, to residents, to developers, to investors. They also provide, a comprehensive plan also provides a legal basis for ordinances and decisions made by cities. There are several components to a comprehensive plan. You can see on the screen here, these are just examples of the chapters within our comprehensive plan and most plans that cities adopt. We have chapters related to the natural environment, future land use of the city, housing goals, solar, transportation, parks and trails, and then our utilities such as sewer, water, stormwater, and how we plan to manage those components. The map shown here is the City of Elko New Market's adopted future land use plan map. As in an earlier map that Tom displayed, the black outline is our current municipal city limits. There are a large colored area outside of our municipal limits that basically guide the land use in various areas outside of the city. Different colors mean different things, so different shades of yellow mean different types of residential. Purple or shades of purple mean different types of industrial. Pinks guide are areas guided to commercial, and so on. The area shown on this map is where the city would reasonably be expected to grow between now and 2040. These are the areas that we have planned for the next 20 years. This table might be hard to see up on the screen, but shows some historical and projected growth for Elko New Market between 1970 and 2040. So the past years are actual growth. You can see that in 1970, we were a very small community. At that point, of course, there were separate cities, Elko and New Market, with a combined population of only 330 people. By 2000, that was a little bit before the cities merged, the city had grown to 804. And then within just a 10-year period between 2000 and 2010, the city had grown from 804 to over 4,000 people. So during that particular decade, Elko New Market was one of the fastest growing cities in Minnesota. We grew by over 400%. The city's population today is 5,200, or that's the state demographer's estimate as of April 2023. And by 2040, we're projected to grow to over 11,000 people. So this map shows how large the city of Elko New Market could realistically be someday. It may be 50, 100, or 150 years from now, but someday Elko New Market will be a much larger city than we are today. Today, our municipal city limits contain only 3.75 acres, square miles. The area on this map, which is what we believe the city's ultimate growth boundary will be, is 29 square miles. So from 3.75 to 29, you can see this, the vast difference. And factors that affect the city's growth, of course, are convenient access to Interstate 35 and our convenient access to the Twin Cities metro area. Elko New Market is also the next city south of Lakeville, which is the fastest growing city in the state. So at some point, it's just natural that we're gonna start to see that overflow. Just a little comparison, I know people don't like to hear this, people that like to live in a small town, but just since the year 2000, Lakeville has grown by over 30,000 people. So if that growth continues south, obviously we'll be a much bigger city. And this is just a little reminder to everybody that growth only occurs when there's a willing buyer, when there's a willing seller, a willing buyer, and a willing developer. The city doesn't control when growth happens. We simply prepare for it by adopting our comprehensive plans and planning for that growth. So that is all that I have, and I'm going to turn it over to Rich.
Thanks, Renee. Hello, everybody. Nice to see some familiar faces from, well, I've been here now since 2006 or so it's coming on 18 years as city engineer. And I am here tonight to talk about how our city's wells can interact with the private wells around the area. So we're going to talk about typical private well construction in the Elko New Market area. We're going to talk about what is well interference, how does it happen. We're going to touch a little bit on aquifer depletion versus interference. We'll talk about Elko New Market's appropriation permit amendment and the request that we made for it, and Elko New Market's 2023 aquifer pump test, the conditions that came along with our approved appropriation permit amendment, namely a well interference response plan and a water quality complaint response plan, and then we'll have time for some questions and answers. Just some things to remember. I'm going to present a lot of complex information in a short time. However, there will be no homework. There's nothing you are being asked to do at this meeting. This is just to give you information. If we need to make separate contact with you as part of one of our response plans or notifications or to obtain information, we'll make separate direct contact by regular mail to you. If you're interested in reading the details on any of the documents that Renee mentioned or that I will mention, they will be posted on the city's website, including the comp plan. So you can go to the city's website and look for that. And as Tom mentioned, you can send questions about tonight's content or anything along the way going forward to my private well at ci.enm.mn.us. So first, typical well construction in this area. There's a variety of geology around the state, around the country, but where we are and where most of you are, and I believe actually all of you, this would be typical. So we'll start at the top. We've got the surface terrain indicated by that blue-green line. You notice that's not a flat line, which you'd expect. We have hills, we have valleys, we have variations in elevation across the terrain. Below that, I'll skip the topsoil layers and the different soil zones near the surface. For the most part, there's 200 to 300 feet of a confining layer of soil on top of between the surface and the aquifers. That's largely consists of clay. There are pockets here and there of sand and gravel that can have water in them that might be able to serve a well, but for the most part, there's a very thick confining layer of clay that we have to get through to actually get to the aquifers. Colored in blue is the Prairie du Chien Jordan aquifer. This is just a representation, but it shows that, and it varies in thickness from, 100 to 200 feet. So it's down deep and it's thick. Below that, there are actually additional aquifers. For the most part, unless you have an older well or large production well, which we don't have any around here, there are additional aquifers that could be drilled into. But when we talk about aquifer at this meeting, we're going to be talking about the Prairie du Chien and the Jordan aquifer. I'm going to elaborate on this because this is important stuff. Forgive me if some of you are familiar with this. I'm guessing some of you are not, so we thought it would be worth the time to go through this, even though it's much simplified from the real world. I think it'll tell you the story of how the wells in this area are developed and why they need to be that way. So I talked about the confining layer of clay. That's generally non-water bearing. You might disagree with me if you've ever tried to build a road on this stuff, but it is not water bearing in the sense that you couldn't poke a well in it and expect to get water unless you happen to get lucky and hit a sand and gravel aquifer, which I'll show on another graphic. Then below that we have the water bearing layers, the different aquifers below us, namely in this case the Prairie du Chien Jordan. And then you might wonder, well, how does water get into the aquifer? And that is really a recharge system. Water falls on the land, some runs off, some evaporates, some is taken up by plants and evapotranspirated, but some does soak into the ground. And over time, and more some areas, less in some others, but on average, over the whole aquifer, water is constantly on its way down, recharging that aquifer for your wells to tap. So that's represented by these squiggly lines with the arrows at the bottom. You'll notice there's also a squiggly line running sideways. Water is not down there sitting still. It's moving very slowly, but almost like a giant river. In our case, it tends to move towards the Minnesota and Mississippi River valleys, where some of it actually is released and goes back into the rivers. So it's a cycle. You've all probably through the years heard of the hydrologic cycle. Rain falls on the land, runs off, fills the rivers, evaporates, makes clouds, more rain. This is also part of that cycle, although it's a much longer because it takes quite a while for water to move through that clay. It can take, hundreds of years, but it's always happening. So water that's reaching the aquifer today might have landed on the ground 200 years ago, but it's constantly happening. So what that does in our case, because of the confining layer, I'm going to advance the slide. Well, sorry, I got ahead of myself. Just a couple of pictures of what that aquifer looks like. A lot of people imagine it's just a big body of water down there, like a lake or something, and that's not the case at all. It's really rock. The Prairie du Chien consists of fractured limestone. So the picture on the left, although it's a little bit misleading because this is a picture of limestone at the surface, so the cracks are much larger and more eroded because of wind and rain and so forth. But it's still fractured limestone, busted up layers of rock. And the water in the Prairie du Chien lives in those cracks. Below that is the Jordan sandstone aquifer. And this is a picture of the actual Jordan sandstone aquifer. There's an outcropping near Stillwater where you can see that material. And so that's what it looks like. So again, a lot of fractures and cracks. Water lives in those cracks. In the sandstone, it's also a more porous material, so there's also water in the rock itself. And so when you drill a well, you have to create some free space and water comes in from all those cracks. So it's not solid water down there. It might be 20% water and 80% rock. Just to give you an idea of the extent of the Jordan aquifer across the Midwest, it's colored in this map in that darkish red color. So you can see it covers most of Iowa, goes well up into Minnesota. We're actually near the northern end of it, but it also goes well over across Wisconsin, up into Michigan. So it's huge. And we just thought that's an interesting picture. It's not just a local thing. This is very, very big. And an important point, mostly it's a confined aquifer, which gets to my next slide. You'll see a cross-looking thing in the blue. It's basically arrows pointing left and right, arrows pointing up and down, just to symbolize this aquifer's under pressure. It's not sitting down there in a stagnant pool. It's more like if you have a juice box with a straw in it, and you squeeze that juice box, water rises up in that straw. That's what happens here. If you drill a well, you have to go down all the way through that 200-foot confining layer of clay. You will not get water until you hit the aquifer down below that. If you stop short, you won't get water. Unless you happen to have hit one of these sand and gravel aquifers. I've drawn that, just a symbol of it with this flat dash line. And there are some of those wells out there. I've had the chance now to look at about 3 dozen well logs from this area. I have yet to see one sand and gravel aquifer. All of them are what they call a bedrock aquifer. You have to go through the clay. You have to hit the prairie du chien, the rock, and then water, because it's under pressure, will rise up in that well. And it will rise up to a point that represents the pressure of the aquifer at that location. So if you drill a well here and another one 500 feet away and another one 5, that water will rise up to pretty much the same level in every one, because that's the pressure of the aquifer at this location. You've probably heard of artesian wells. These are artesian wells. They just aren't at such a pressure level that water's coming out of the top of the ground. That does happen. I'm not aware of any around here, but these are artesian wells, meaning the water will rise up in the well because it's under pressure. But that is not the water level. The water is way down in the aquifer itself, not in the clay. Just checking to make sure I didn't miss anything. I do want to talk about a little bit more about the notion of what that aquifer is like down there. So I said it's not a lake. You could think of it more as a pipeline, and even the plumbing in your house. If you want to connect to a water line in your house, you have to connect to that water line and pierce it so water can flow, because it's under pressure. If you don't get there, you're not going to get water. Let's see, what else did I have on here? Bedrock wells. So I talked about how when you actually get that well, which is just a tube, can be 4 inches, 6 inches, 12 inches, whatever tube you put down through the clay, you pierce that aquifer, water will rise up into it. You don't have to put your well, or your pump, I'm sorry, down at the bottom. You just have to put your pump in this pump placement zone somewhere below where the water rises in the well and above the aquifer, because the pressure of the aquifer does the rest of the work for you. So that blue line is a static water level that really represents the pressure of the aquifer, not the water level in the soil. And normally a well driller will choose a location below that static water level. Once the well is drilled, they'll put drop pipe down, they'll put a submersible pump, and they'll put that 10 or 20 feet, some distance they feel is reasonably far enough below the water level that you'll have a good supply of water. And that'll be important when we start talking about interference, which is next. What interference is when you have a mixture of wells. You might have regular, normal, private domestic wells like you all have, and then a big well, like a city well or an irrigation well or an industrial well or something like that nearby. Those big wells tend to be drilled deeper down well into the aquifer, not just touching the top, because they need more surface area to get the water that they need into the well. But when those wells pump, it causes a pressure loss in the area of that well. I know you can't see my fingers on this screen, but if you imagine the bottom of that big well, it's sucking water and it's creating sort of, not a vacuum, but a drop in pressure. Water races to fill that loss in pressure, and it creates that drawdown, which is that parabolic shaped dashed line that flows away from it. So that, when that well is pumping, is there a pointer? Or, oh, I can use my mouse.
It's not showing. No, because you have a presentation, so it won't show up. Yeah, it's in presentation mode, so it won't show up.
You want to go point to the, for me?
I am glad to play with that.
We don't want this to be missed. So basically what happens when a big well is pumping, it changes that static water line. Instead of the solid blue, the pressure drops and that static water line drops. The harder you pump and the longer you pump up to a point, which we'll discuss, it grows and goes deeper. If that dashed line intersects with a private well nearby, and that dashed line is lower than the pump in that private well won't get water, because it's now, the water level is below the pump. It can't suck air. It can only suck air. It can't get any water. That's interference. It is not depletion, but it is very important, and that's the number one thing we're going to be managing throughout this whole process as the city grows. You know, every new permit, every new well will be managing interference. So I am going to move on from that. We can come back to it if there's questions later. Just a little bit about depletion versus interference. Depletion would be that the water being either drawn out of the well or flowing out of the aquifer, I'm sorry, or out of the aquifer to the river. If that amount leaving the aquifer exceeds the amount coming in through recharge, you have depletion. The water pressure will drop, and eventually, if it keeps going, the rocks that make up the aquifer will start to have air in the voids instead of water. Pretty much that simple. Depletion is not a concern here at this time anyway. I would imagine as populations grow, it could be something we have to deal with when the city is the size of Lakeville. I don't know that. I can't predict that. At this point, depletion was not raised as a concern by the DNR at any point in its review of the city's permit amendment application. But interference certainly was. This aquifer is vast, as I showed you on the map. It's thick. It's continually recharging and releasing water. When we monitored wells during our pump test and stopped our pump test, those water levels came back within several days, which is a very healthy sign of a well-fed aquifer. So interference is the management concern. I just keep repeating that because depletion gets confused with that. Oh, they're going to take all the water. Well, probably not going to take all the water, but we could interfere with your well, and we are aware of that. That's why we're here, is to begin this process of sorting that out, doing what we can to prevent it, or warn you, or be ready ahead of time what to do. Just a quick note, and you'll see when I get to it, our new appropriation permit allows the city to withdraw up to 365 million gallons of water in 1 year from the Jordan Prairie to Cheyenne Aquifer. That would be equivalent to 1 inch of rain landing on the outreach area of this meeting. We sent invitations to a 5-mile diameter circle, basically. 1 inch of rain fell on that. That's 365 million gallons a day. If anybody wants to do the math and let me know if I'm wrong, that'd be just fine. So it's a lot of water, but in the scheme of things, relative to the scale, relative to the amount of rain we typically get, the area well beyond that that's also contributing recharge. I think it helps illustrate a little bit why depletion's probably not going to be an issue here for quite some time. So interference is different than depletion.
Yeah, but I thought you're describing interference.
We're talking about interference at this meeting. That's the purpose of all these plans.
Right.
So, yep, I'll push on, and then if there's still questions when we're done, we'll talk. So if there are, and I believe I heard you guys had an issue with running out of water. That would have been interference, not depletion. We didn't take water out of the aquifer such that everybody lost water. We did drawdown such that the pressure at your well, if we get it sorted, would have made your pump higher than the water level. Once we stopped pumping, it probably came back and would have been restored.
Yeah, so the pumping has an effect.
The pumping has an effect,
Yeah.
but yeah. So a slight nuance there, but,
Yeah, but keep pumping and you have a constant effect. I get the message.
Yep,
I
yep,
got that
yep,
figured out.
yep.
So if you stop pumping, we won't have a problem.
That's one way to look at it, yes. So, we'll do questions at the end. Let me just burn through. All right.
Ma'am, there's a lot of people here that are looking for information. We'd be happy to answer questions later, but if you could let us
It
push
wasn't a
on.
question, your facts don't even make sense. But, okay, go ahead.
So, just some history on the city's water usage. And the purpose of this slide is to show that we're now using more water than we used to, and we will continue to change that. So back in September of 2010, the city's 2010 water supply plan was approved by the DNR. At that time, we were permitted for 135 million gallons a year. At that time, it was much more water than we needed annually. But that same year, we projected in 2020 to need a volume of 400 million gallons a year. Of course, we didn't reach that. So we're always looking ahead. What do we think we'll need? Planning for that, also managing what we do need. 2019, we put in a new well, got that amendment approval. Still at 135 million gallons a year. We still weren't using up to our full allocation, but we were getting closer. So actually in 2023 was the first year we actually pumped about the limit of our appropriation permit at 135 million gallons. Then in June of 2024, so just this spring, our appropriation permit volume was approved. We got an amendment to increase it up to 365 million gallons. We are still projecting ahead, so in 2040, we're projecting that volume that we're going to need to be 630. This is a process that has happened before, is happening now, and will continue happening if and when the city grows, as Renee laid out. Just very quickly, how we arrived at the 365 million gallons a year. Our current demand, as we know from 2023, is 135 million gallons a year. I should point out that that's not consistent. Some years it's more, some years it's less, and it depends a lot on the weather. If we have a hot, dry year like 2023, 2022, 2021, we use more water than we do this year. We're barely pumping more than we would in the wintertime because of all the rain this year. However, we know we got to stay ahead of that, so we applied for a permit amendment. Our current demand plus phase one of an industrial user, that's 155 million gallons added to that, plus room for city growth of approximately 2,500 people, another 75 million gallons a year, equals the 365 million gallons a year that we asked for and were approved for.
Could I just quickly ask, when do you expect to have that amount of new people, the 2,500? Do you have a projected date on that?
I don't off the top of my head, but
If we can hold with the questions until the end so we can work through the presentation. There'll be Q&A pushing at the end of after the presentation.
yeah. So part of our request to increase our withdrawal rate was we had to do an aquifer pump test. This was required by the DNR. So they could look at the impacts on the aquifer and interference issues. It's required in support of appropriation permits to assess the sustainability and interference impact of applications like ours. It's used especially when information on the aquifer in the applicant's area is limited, which it was. There hadn't been, to my knowledge, a pump test in this area, at least for as long as I've been here. And this pump test is the applicant's responsibility. So we had to prepare a test pump plan, which wells we're going to pump, where we're going to discharge, how we're going to treat it, how we're going to measure everything, monitor at different locations. And then the DNR reviews that and approves it and gives us the okay to conduct the test. Just briefly what we did, our big wells, Tom mentioned we have 3. We ran as much water as our treatment plant could process because we had to treat everything we pumped. We couldn't just discharge it to ground because we couldn't discharge to the Vermilion River watershed because that would influence the results of looking for impacts on the Vermilion. So we had to treat it and route it and get rid of excess water that we couldn't use outside of that watershed, which meant it had to go through our treatment plant, which can't handle everything our wells can pump.
Those of us that don't know, where are your 3 wells at?
They're roughly in the middle of the circles on the maps. We're not to divulge that information for security reasons. That's just the rules. But they're generally up and down a line along France Avenue, some south of France and one north, but kind of on that line. So. During the pump test, we pumped 42 million gallons. And I was explaining, we couldn't run all 3 wells at the same time because we can't treat that much water. So what we ended up doing is run our biggest well full on, round the clock for 2 weeks and monitor what's happening in area wells around it. We had picked several private domestic wells, our own monitoring wells. We drilled some other well, a couple of them actually, so we could check for connectivity between sand and gravel wells, between wetlands, between various points in the aquifer, and measured that drawdown. We had automated measuring equipment in those wells that measured the water level every minute for the whole 4 weeks plus 2 weeks afterwards as the aquifer recharged. So our biggest well for 2 weeks, full on, that's about 830 gallons per minute. We shut that one off, immediately turned on our other 2 wells for a total pumping rate then of about 1,235 gallons per minute for another 2 weeks straight, round the clock, measuring drawdown the whole time, recording all that information so we could turn it over to the DNR. This would have been early November to early December of last year. Yep. We did have one well that we drilled into a sand and gravel aquifer, so we could also check for influence on that. So a pretty vigorous test. I mentioned 42 million gallons. That's quite a bit more water, certainly than we use now, and it's more water than we actually project to use next year when our new industrial customer comes online. So I'm going to move on. Based, yes. No, we're mixing things up. We are allowed to pump now up to 365 million gallons a year. During our aquifer pump test back in November, December, we pulled 42 million gallons. We won't. We don't have those extra 2,500 people, and Niagara won't be fully up to speed using that until probably May or June. So
That's next year.
that's next year.
So I would ask going forward through the presentation that if you have questions, to hold those till we get to the end. Otherwise, we won't get there. Plus, when we get to the Q&A, we'll want to repeat it for people that aren't in this room so that they can hear the questions that are being asked. So I'd ask that you don't interrupt the presentation. We have allotted a significant amount of time for Q&A. So let's wait until we get to the end of the presentation because your question might be answered during the presentation. If it's not, we'll get it then.
So we pumped the aquifer as hard as we could and still treat the water. We collected all the data every minute at multiple different measuring points at different distances, different depths, different features. When that test was over, we bundled all that data up, gave it to the DNR, and they analyzed it, looking for things related to well interference, aquifer sustainability. The outcome of that was an aquifer test report, which I'm going to cover next. The first, and some of these are just quotes out of it, and that analysis of the data shows the aquifers are capable of supplying the requested rate and progressive declines of the groundwater are not likely. There's more to it. This document is posted on our website. If you want to go read it yourself, you certainly can. But basically, that sentence means that there was water moving into the area adequately to meet the 1.2 to 1.7 million gallons a day demand during the pump test. And we know that because I mentioned earlier, the longer and harder you pump, the deeper that drawdown goes. There came a point where it stopped and stabilized and didn't continue to go down. So we know at that point, it's equilibrium. Water is able to move in from other areas to this area and match what we were drawing out. It didn't keep going down. Another paragraph, modeling demonstrated that well interference is possible within approximately 1 mile of Elko wells 2, 3, and 4. And those are just the numbers of our 3 production wells. The risk of interference to each domestic well will be calculated outside of this report, which they did. We have that report. I will be covering that after this. And then they also looked at effects on wetlands, the Vermilion River, which I mentioned, and the Kelleher Fen, which is about 10 miles north of here, basically found no impact from our pumping on those features. Then they did a memo on well interference potential. That was referenced in the report. It would be done separately. The outcome of that separate evaluation was this memo on well interference, also on the website if you want to read it in detail. And so I'm just going to read this verbatim. Describes the analysis that was conducted to calculate the risk of well interference based on the revised peak monthly pumping volume. This memo lists what is known about domestic wells within 1 mile, presents the risk of well interference for wells where enough is known about the well construction to determine the risk, and recommends where additional information is needed. This memo is a supplement to the aquifer test report and supersedes an earlier well interference memo that they did based on different flow projections. So this particular memo modeled drawdown at 1.2 million gallons a day for 1 month with that well running nonstop round the clock. That would be our largest well running nonstop. I will just let you briefly take a look at this slide. It describes how they set up their model to predict what the drawdown would be at all the different wells they had information for. Basically, they program a computer model based on the data we got from the pump test, so they know the characteristics of the aquifer now because of that pump test. They plug it into their computer model and predict the drawdown for the rate I talked about at all the wells they have information for within 1 mile. The very bottom one is important. What at risk means is when they project that water level at your well, if there's less than 10 feet of water remaining above the pump, they deemed it at risk. It doesn't mean you're going to go out of water. It just means that it's less than 10 feet of water. When we're running at our max rate for 1 month, they would expect to see less than 10 feet of water above the pump at the well that's deemed at risk. Another important thing to kind of keep a note of from the Minnesota Well Index, which is where basically it's like an atlas of all the wells that have records entered. There are 174 known wells within 1 mile of city wells. That doesn't mean all wells are known, and we'll talk about that. So they have a section in the memo on wells at risk for interference. They found 7 of the known wells that had less than 10 feet of water at that rate of estimated pumping. So those are at risk, and what they're asking the city to do in the well interference plan that I'll cover later, we have to go out and verify that that information in the well index for those 7 wells is still accurate. Sometimes people have service done, they might have the pump lowered or something done that changes things. They want us to make sure that information is current because those, at least based on the information they have, are the most sensitive wells. We have sent out questionnaires to those 7. Perhaps I should have had this meeting before I did that. I might have gotten ahead of myself a little bit there and made some people nervous, but only 7, and actually I added 1 on request that we agreed to investigate. So I sent out 8 questionnaires on that out of the 174 known wells within 1 mile of the city. And I will talk more about what we have to do with those. But basically, we need to verify that that information is still correct, because those, at this point, in what they know, are the most at risk from our pumping. There are wells with unknown risk for well interference. So they have found 45 known wells, but those known wells didn't have complete information, either water level or pump depth or something else that didn't, so they couldn't finish determining if that well was at risk or not. They are asking us in the interference plans that I'll talk about later to contact those well owners, try and get that missing information, contact well drillers if the homeowners don't have it to see if they have it, and then either possibly open those wells and take measurements so we get that information, or we set that aside and go right to a well agreement, which we'll talk about when we get to the interference plans. So, at-risk wells, then there's 45 wells known about incomplete information. There are wells at low risk for well interference. So I mentioned the 174 wells, I talked about the 7, I talked about the 45. They found 122 wells that are low risk for well interference, simply because even with our pumping going on, the pump is known to be well below the water level, even at that rate. So they recommend no further action on those 122 wells, which may include some people in this room. I don't have that at my fingertips and certainly don't have it memorized. But if you don't hear more from us, any requests for information or questionnaires, and are only getting notifications, it's a good chance you're falling into one of those 122 wells that are at low risk, because they're already, the pump is deep enough into that well. And then finally, there are probably wells that are not listed in the Minnesota Well Index. That means the DNR don't know about them, we don't know about them, there's no way to determine if they're at risk or not. We have to, as part of our response plans, try and find those wells. And our first approach, and this meeting is not for that, but it'll be a similar approach. We're going to look for properties within 1 mile of city wells that are not on city water, that have a building, that are not in the well index, and send those property owners a questionnaire. Do you have a well? Do you have any information? That type of thing. That hasn't happened yet. It will be happening, but that's how we'll go about trying to at least first get that information. In the DNR's well interference memo, I just wanted to clear up one thing. You can read it for yourself, but the last second of the last sentence, there are over 1,300 parcels within 1 mile of Elko New Market's wells, which could have domestic wells not listed in the Minnesota Well Index. The part that they overlooked is that most of those 1,300 parcels are in the city limits on city water and are not at risk of any sort of interference. So we actually reran that. We found 72 parcels. They're highlighted in lavender on this map. They're within or touched by a 1 mile radius from city wells. They are not on city water. They have no well listed in the Minnesota Well Index, but there is a building of some sort indicating the parcel might have a well. So if you add these 72 to the 174, there's about 250 wells out there that we either have to verify the information, get additional information, confirm whether or not there's a well there, and turn it over to the DNR so they can finish determining which wells are most at risk, and that will lead to other requirements, which I'll cover when I get into the interference plans, which now, good news, can go much more quickly because I've already told you most of what the important information. I've repeatedly mentioned our appropriation permit amendment. I have an error on here. We applied for an increase from 135, not 125 million gallons a year, to 365. We made that application in November of 2022. We got finally approval to increase our withdrawal in June of 2024, so a year and a half later, after a lot of review, pump test memo. The increased pumping is projected, if we have a dry year, we might hit the numbers in that trigger some of these activities in June, July of 2025. If it's a wet year, we may not. But the biggest increases in pumping relative to our history, would be expected about a year from now, maybe a little less. Even then, that increased pumping is anticipated to be less than the pumping rates during our 2023 aquifer test. Until tonight, I was aware of one potential well interference issue during our pump test. Now I'm aware of two. I've had not the opportunity to investigate either, but out of the all the wells I mentioned during our pump test, other than those two, we're not aware of any out-of-water complaints. Well, you haven't told me about it yet, so qualified. As of this meeting, I knew of two.
Was one of them us?
No. Out of water complaints. We'll cover water quality separately. I'll keep pushing on, time is running. The permit conditions. So they issued us this permit, yes, you can increase your water, but you gotta do these two things. You have to conduct this well interference response plan, which I will cover next, and water quality complaints response plan, which I'll also cover. The interference response plan, just an overview. This is intended to plan for and address out-of-water complaints. No water coming out of the tap that might occur during, due to city pumping activity. An out-of-water incident would occur if our pumping caused the water level at your private well to be drawn down below the level of the pump in your well. I said, when I prepared this, well, actually, this is true. During the aquifer test pumping, no out-of-water complaints were reported. We didn't hear about them until months later. But very low out-of-water complaints. This plan that I'm about to go through applies to wells within 1 mile of a city pumping well unless a specific case beyond that distance is referred back to the city by the DNR. So in short, our response area is 1 mile from our wells. Our responsibility area could go further if the DNR determines there's a probable link between our pumping and interference, even if it's more than 1 mile. I am going to give you a summary before and after. It's the same thing. So the interference response plan is focused on prevention and cure. There's a thing over my, I can't read it here. Well, I'll turn around. It's based on out of water, prevention and cure. No water on the tap. This is different than the quality, which we'll cover later. Prevention and cure. It has two parts. Info gathering. So we're trying to help the DNR determine what wells are at risk and preparing to be able to respond to those timely if and when they happen. And then investigations, what to do if interference happens. I talked about our response area, and I will remind you again, if you have a well in that radius, no matter what, you're going to get some kind of additional information. It might just be a notification that our pumping is going to be going up in the next couple months, or it might be a request for information, a questionnaire, follow-up. But that'll all be handled outside. There's nothing you need to do at this meeting or after it related to this.
Point of clarification, so this plan you're going to tell us about is only for the wells within 1 mile?
It applies to all wells, but our response, so in these response plans, the city's responsible to respond if someone within 1 mile complains, hey, I got no water. Then it's our job, if you're at 1.1 miles or 8 miles, then you call the DNR. If the DNR says, hey, we think that's related to Elko New Market, they could send it back to us and we'd still be responsible. It's just response, so that we're not trying to manage wells, that are not likely to be affected by us.
Terminologies in the presentation, you make sure you stay with either 1 mile from the pump station or 1 mile from the city limits, because it's two different scenarios.
It's actually, what it is 1 mile from city wells. And all distances would be from city wells. So we have 3 wells. We draw 1 mile around, radius around it, and connect those lines. So it's 1 mile from our big production wells, not from our city limits, not from our towers.
Reference to city limits, just want to clarify that, so.
Yeah, no, it's, all the distances are from wells. By the way, On the city's website, if you go there, there will be maps that show the parcels within the 1 mile and the 2.5 mile to help you sort out, because I know people don't know exactly how far they are.
So
But you
Rich,
could look
some
at that.
feedback that we're getting from outside of this room, if you could speak closer to the microphone because
Oh.
you're getting awful quiet.
Okay,
And then two, if
I'm
you're
getting
gonna
worn
take,
out.
if you're gonna take questions, if you could repeat the question that was asked, because people outside of this room can't hear what the question is, and so there's no context for your response.
I'll try not to take questions, but I get excited, so we'll just keep going, and we'll take the questions when we get to the end. I think I covered this. Next slide, information gathering. We have to do all this before we begin pumping, and we have to do it far enough in advance of increased pumping so the DNR can finish processing and determining what wells are at risk, so that they can tell us which property owners we need to approach with well agreements. We have to get pump depth, type of pump, all this stuff. You can read it for yourself. So I'm going to move a little faster because we've kind of covered this. So this is for the 7 wells. We've sent those questionnaires. We also have to try and get information on the 45 wells where there's incomplete information. We have not sent those out yet, so if you're not sure, please be patient. We have to sort out and reconcile differences in what we're finding with the DNR, and that's in process. All these will be pushed out to people based on these plans by regular mail. We also have to try and find wells where they may not exist in the MWI, so nobody knows they're there. And that'll be another mailing. That has not gone out yet. And the purpose of that part of the plan, again, finding undocumented wells to get information. Once we've gathered all that information that we could find on the different wells, 250 of them or so, bundle it all off to the DNR. They'll finish their analysis. They'll tell us, okay, these 10 or 20 or 30 or 5, however many they deem are at risk based on that 10-foot water level above the pump, have to be offered well agreements. And a well agreement is basically a document that we give to you that says what will happen if there's an interference, who to call, what to do, who's responsible. The city's responsible to restore service to prior conditions if our pumping causes an interference issue where you're out of water. And that agreement spells that out. So you get the agreement, you throw it in a drawer. 2 years later, something happens where you're out of water. You pull it out, sign it, call us up. We'll act on that agreement as though it was executed right away. And I don't plan to go through that in detail, but basically it just explains everything that'll happen, who's responsible, what you need to do, what we need to do to address that issue. By the way, just because there may not be a well agreement offered and there was a mistake or something missed or something changed and you were deemed to be not at risk but end up having an interference issue and it was caused by the city's pumping, it would still be the city's responsibility to restore that. So the agreement doesn't gain you additional privileges. It just tries to give you a heads up that this might be happening and position everybody to react if something does. Maybe more quickly. But you will be mailed regardless information what to do if you run out of water, even if you don't have a well agreement. There'll be phone numbers for around-the-clock contact to the city and what to do as far as hiring a contractor, saving receipts, that type of thing. We also, in addition to mailing you this information that says what you have to do, we have to post information on the city's website and do another mass flyer like we did for this invitation tonight about the same issue. So that's the information gathering, the first part, information gathering and well agreements. Then it's, and notifications. Now we're in the investigations of out-of-water complaints. This is fairly straightforward. You call us up, hey, I'm out of water. If we have a well agreement and we have to respond to that, we roar out there with, you know, some drinking water and make arrangements to get your service restored. If you don't have agreement, you call a well contractor. We can help you with that. There'll be information on the website of how to find a well contractor. They come and fix it, save the receipts, save the notes, turn that over to us, and we'll evaluate what our part was in it and make things right. The details, again, in the plans on the website if you want to look at those. So there's two options that this is covering that I don't intend to read to you. One is if there is a well agreement, the other if there isn't. You're protected either way. State law and our agreements and our permit require us to restore you to service if the problem is caused by our pumping.
If I could ask the side conversations that are going on, if people could be quieter, it's becoming a little bit distracting and can make it harder for some individuals to hear.
So I'm going to repeat the summary for the interference response plan. I told you this at the beginning, went through very quickly the details, and now back to that summary just to put a beginning and end. The interference response plan is focused on out-of-water prevention and cure. There's two parts, info gathering. We are just starting that part now, determining what wells are at risk and preparing for a timely response if there's a problem. It has an investigation section, what the city has to do and how we address those. The city's response area is 1 mile from city wells, which there are 3, and there are maps on the website. Our responsibility area is not limited to 1 mile. If the DNR determines that our pumping caused a problem 2 miles away, we're still responsible to restore that to service. It's just a matter of who you call first. And if you call us and it's more than that, we'll just turn it over to the DNR and work through that. And they would do the same in the inverse. And finally, you will receive further information if you have a well in that radius, whether it's only a notification or request for information. So that's really the takeaways for the well interference plan. Now, we're going to talk about the water quality response plan. And I've heard murmurings through the evening and winding up. I know there's a lot of interest in this. We are committed to investigating, taking these complaints in, figuring what happened. A lot related to the test pumping back in November, December. We are aware of it. Tonight's meeting is not to try and sort out what happened or negotiate. We're presenting you the plans, and we will be working that. We already are. We've sent out some questionnaires. Another round went out on Friday to additional 25 complaints that we're aware of. If any of you are here and got a questionnaire today and there was no envelope, we sent envelopes just so you have a way to return it. That went in the mail today. So wait a day or two and you'll have an envelope to return your questionnaire in. So this plan is intended to plan for and address changed water conditions, not out of water conditions. That's the other plan. So it applies for the duration of the permit. If it happens back in November during the pump test, or it happens in 3 years when our pumping keeps going up, this plan applies. It was prompted by water quality complaints received by the DNR and the city related to our aquifer tests. We've reviewed contacts from, I think it's roughly 50 people at this point. Most of them came in the past few months. But there's a common theme. The water's discolored or smelly. It's clogging my filters or my equipment, and it's staining my fixtures. Most contacts also reported that the water returned to normal within several days when it was first noticed. I presume when the city ended its pump test and the water levels returned, that things went back to normal. We have received some questionnaires back from folks already. We have not gone through those. We're still compiling those, and we've been busy getting other stuff out. So be patient. It's going to take some time to try and figure out. Our main goal first is to figure out why is this happening? because there's just a lot of things about it that don't make sense. But that's our first goal. Then we will be sharing that information, what we learn and what we plan to do. But I don't have those answers tonight, so just to let you know in case you were planning to ask any pointed questions. We will be following up on all complaints. And I already mentioned this will take some time. So that's the overview. Here's the summary. This plan's focused on water quality changes at private wells due to city pumping. This plan has three main themes. We're going to build background quality data for the aquifer. DNR has asked us to sample at 20 different wells, meeting different criteria throughout the aquifer, different depths, different locations, different types of aquifer, although they're all in the same connected aquifer. So we have background water quality data before we increase our pumping sometime next year. We have to do notification to all of the people within 2.5 miles of our wells prior to that pumping increase next year. And we have to investigate and remedy all complaints. This area is 2.5 miles because it's not about out of water, it's about influence due to our pumping. Even if it's only a foot of drawdown and it causes some kind of a change, we have to address that. More information will be sent to you when fitting regarding that issue. So I'm going to summarize these because there's a lot of words and I don't want to read them. But we have to go out, I mentioned 20 wells. We have to find 20 wells meeting certain criteria, gather water quality data, which is pretty robust. There's a lengthy list of things we have to test for, record that. We have to do that before we increase our pumping sometime next year. Stage 2, and this is terminology right out of the plan. So this gives the criteria. You can see it's screened in various levels of the aquifer, representative neighborhoods. Some must be close to the city, some have to have, and they all have to have spatial variability, aquifer variability, coverage of the city wells. The DNR needs to approve these wells before we can do this sampling. So I'm just going to ask you now, please don't volunteer. We would rather look at the criteria and pick the wells that matches it than screen 100 applications, use my well, and have to go back to you, tell you no, and deal with it. So if you don't mind, we don't expect to find problems because this does not involve opening the well. It doesn't involve putting anything in. It's just a matter of going to your house, grabbing a sample, taking some measurements, and leaving. And we have to do that 3 different times. We have to do it before the pumping increases. We have to go back out again when the pumping is increased to 1 million gallons a day for more than 14 days. We have to gather it then. We have to go back one more time. After that higher pumping subsides, we would expect that to be in the fall of the year following the first season of higher pumping due to Niagara and city usage from irrigation, which goes up substantially most summers. So the purpose of this is to gather baseline data. So if we get a complaint, we can compare it to these different stages of water quality, see if there's something different and what, and maybe figure out why. We plan to use a third party to gather these samples. It takes specialized equipment and expertise to make sure that sample is gathered without contamination, gathered from the right spot, properly coded and monitored so that it doesn't get mixed up on the way to the lab and back. So we'll be using a third party that has those that equipment and skills. And if we take a sample from your well or your neighbor and we find something of a health concern like arsenic or manganese or nitrates that exceed the health standards, we will notify you so you're aware of it and can walk through whether it's the city's fault or not. It's a condition we're going to want you to know about. There's a notification stage in here. Just like on the response plan, we have to let you all know before we significantly increase our pumping. That is spelled out in the water quality response plan. So people within 2.5 miles will get a notification before that increased pumping begins. So you can keep a heads up and keep an eye out for anything, and hopefully, if something happens, be prepared, rather than like our pump test where many of you didn't know it was coming, I'm sure. This step, the schedule, will depend on seasonal weather. If we have a wet year next year, we may not get to the point where we have to do that second round of sampling. But that's the soonest we would expect it, sometime next summer. It also sets minimums. So if we figure out what's causing this and it's something that's preventable or minimizable, we will send out additional information to talk you through that and give recommendations. Stage 3, I already mentioned, we have to go out during the pump. That's what stage 3 is. During the higher pumping, we have to go grab samples, all the same locations, all the same constituents again, and keep and record the results. And then again, we have to go out after that pumping falls off later in the year. I don't know that I mentioned yet, well, maybe I did. The city pumps quite a bit more water typically in the summer than it does in the winter, largely because of lawn irrigation. Then the next part of the water quality response plan is investigating these water quality complaints. So if we get a complaint from an owner of a well within 2.5 miles, we have to respond to it. Same thing as the interference. If it's more than that, it doesn't mean we're not responsible. It just means that the DNR will make that determination and turn it over to us if they think we're responsible. So we'll look at the distance when we get a time your computer. So I'm going to mostly wing it, but I will look back here. Basically, we get a complaint. If it's within 2.5 miles, we'll get you a questionnaire. We'll ask for additional information and try and sort out what happened.
Somebody.
Oh, it might have been me.
You just got too excited.
Well, that'll happen.
You keep talking, I will
All
fire
right.
back up.
So we're going to ask you to provide us, and some of you have seen these questionnaires, not too many, but some of you, description and timeline for. Thank you, thank you. We'll be asking for things like a description and timeline of what happened. Now it went away altogether. Information about your well, if you have it, information about your treatment systems, that type of thing. And then we'll look at that, compare the data. If you have any sample results from sampling you did yourself, we'll compare that to the background data that we'd already collected and decide if things are meaningfully different and try and work out what our part is in it and make it right, however that is. We don't have any preconceived notions at this point. What do you find in there?
Just give me a minute here, Rich.
In a way, that's kind of the gist of it. I mean, there's details, you can look those up, but there won't be well agreements with this. It's just if you have a water quality problem, you let us know. We'll ask you for stuff. We'll go investigate it. And if we determine it's our fault, we'll make some offer of restitution to either fix it or pay you or whatever. If we feel it's not related to the city, we will advise you and the DNR of that. If you don't like our answer, you can appeal that to the DNR.
You have to figure out where you're at.
That's probably close enough. The other part that I didn't mention is that the plan does require, if we have a water quality complaint, we would go out and do sampling at that well to see how the data compares to the baseline data that I talked about gathering. So there will be a lot of numbers. It's going to take some time, but we are working on that, and we are responsible if we caused a water quality issue at your house during our pumping. This is just some of the ways we might fix it. We might contract with a qualified firm to recommend in-home treatment and prepare a corrective action agreement where we'd spell out, okay, we're going to do this, this, and this. The city's going to pay this and this. We may just offer you a cash settlement agreement. They shall consider the capital costs and operations, maintenance, repair, replacement, but only to the extent that it restores prior conditions, to prior conditions. And again, if you don't like where it's going at any point, you may appeal to the DNR if we can't get to terms with you. So, a summary of the water quality response plan again. It's focused on water quality changes at private wells. 3 main themes: building background quality data for the aquifer, notification prior to large pumping increases, investigation and remedy of complaints, our response area, not our responsibility area, but our response area is 2.5 miles from city wells. Maps will be on our website that you can see if you fall in that area. But if you are outside and notify us, we will certainly pass that on to the DNR to process. And if we need more information or to meet this plan, more information is due to you, it will be sent to you. This meeting doesn't satisfy any of those requirements, as Tom said up front. We're just trying to push information out to you. We know it's overwhelming in a short time, but at least you're aware of what's going on somewhat and can certainly get more information or send questions to us. And that is the end of my remarks. I'm going to sit for questions.
So,
Can you turn your mic on if you answer questions?
so thank you, everybody. This was a lot of information, and we appreciate you sitting through all of that. Again, the presentation tonight, we've recorded it. We plan on posting it on the city's website within the next few days. So if there's information you want to go back and look at or something that you missed, you're certainly going to be able to do that. Also, we have the blue cards, which are located in each of the audience areas, which have one, the city's website, and it'll tell you where to go on the city's website to be able to see the video and get other information. Rich referenced, I'll call you in a minute, ma'am. You don't have to keep your hand up all the time. No, but thank you. So you'll be able to find the documents, many of which that Rich referenced. So the aquifer tests conducted by the DNR, the technical memos, et cetera. Those will be located on that page as well. The other thing is there's also an email address on there for if you have questions or concerns related to your wells. We ask that you use that on well stuff rather than going to like Rich's individual email address or mine if you happen to have it. We get high volumes of it and we don't want to lose your information, so we want to make sure that it's going to a central location on all the well stuff so we can make sure that it's accounted for and doesn't get lost or fall through the cracks. So with that said, we are going to start a Q&A period. We have approximately 120 people in the building, and we have another 45 people online. We don't know how many questions that we're going to get, but that's a lot of people. And we're going to provide an opportunity for us to answer as many questions as we can and to ask as many people's questions as we can. So one question per person, and we might come back around if we get through the whole list. And we're going to go until 9 o'clock. At 9 o'clock, if we haven't gotten through everybody's questions, there'll be the opportunity for you to ask them using the email that I was just talking about. And if you don't feel comfortable asking your question in front of the large crowd, we understand staff will hang around for a little bit afterwards for you to be able to ask questions one-on-one outside of the meeting. So we're going to do this old school. You can raise your hand. I think we're going to start with Vita's question that she asked earlier, and then we'll start moving around and ask everybody to raise their hands. You got a gold star because you raised your hand. So we'll go there, and then we'll start moving around the audience. I will take a break from in-person to allow people that are online to participate as well, and we'll also take a break to take questions from people that are in the hallway and in the back room. So we'll do a little bit of round robin as we're working through, and I'll ask my staff to be able to identify those people for those questions. So let's start with Vita's question about population.
Posting the presentation online too, or just the video?
The
video-
presentation has already been posted online. The slides are already posted online, yes. Vita's question,
So
as
the question that was asked, is the presentation itself going to be posted online? Yes, it is already posted on the My Private Well page on the city's website. Now on to Vita's question.
Vita's question related to Rich's information regarding the city's water appropriations permit. And Rich indicated that we have allocated water for an additional approximately 2,500 people. So for the city to grow about 2,500 people. And Vita asked approximately how long we expected that growth to take. And the best information that I can give you is that today we're 5,200 people. And the Met Council and the state demographer projects the city to be, by 2030, about 8,500 people. So it's going to be sometime between now and 2030. I would say, in the 2028 time period. I mean, it's anybody's best guess, but the state demographer is projecting 8,500 by 2030.
Okay. Ma'am, if you
Ask
could,
it from here?
yeah, and then I'll just repeat it for everybody so they know.
Perfect, okay. So my question is, when industrial projects are approved and it affects the city usage, does that industrial project pay for all of these tests that have to be done? Or does that come out of the taxpayers' city money as well as the restitution or possible corrections that may have to be made because of industrial projects that may use more water than, say, typical residents or typical industrial projects?
So I'm going to simplify that a little bit, but I understand what you're asking. So the question is, if you have a large user that comes onto the system, such as an industrial user or commercial user that uses more than a normal residential use, do they have to pay for all of the stuff that Rich was talking about related to response plans and corrective actions, et cetera? Not directly. And the reason for that is they're just like any other user on the system. They are paying proportionately for what they use, and we pay for it through the fees that they pay. So when you have a large user, they pay a significant amount, and that revenue can help pay for those items. If,
Every city resident also pays, and it comes out of their money too, right?
so the,
When you say the city's conducting tests, the city doesn't make money.
correct.
It's
So,
from the taxpayer.
so here's one of the things that I think there's often a misconception on. When we pump water, the permit for the volume of water is the city's permit. We are responsible for that. Whether it's an industrial user that's equivalent to 1,500 homes or 1,500 homes, the volume that we're pumping has the same result and results in the same requirements that we have. And so the users on the system pay. So if, for example, there was no large industrial user that was coming to the community, at some point, you can see from the projections that Renee was presenting, we're going to be at those same volumes regardless down the road. Maybe not quite as fast, but we'll be there. The same requirements, same impacts, same things would be in place. The difference is that the residents of those 15 homes would be paying, not a commercial or industrial user. So in fact, arguably, there's we can put the burden for some of these costs on a commercial user as opposed to our residents who are buying at a residential rate. So, thank you, it's a very good question. Ma'am, in the back.
So it's somebody that lives just a frog's hair outside your 2.5 responsibility area of a private well. How does the person go about getting on the list to be notified of when pumping is happening or anything else? How do I get included in those mailings?
So the question was, the area that's been identified for the DNR for us to be responsible for these response plans is 2.5 miles for water quality, 1 mile for interference. And the question is, well, what if I live at 2.6 miles or 2.8 miles? How do I know what's going on and how do I get notified? And Rich, I'll have you answer that question.
Can I dovetail that with, I've already filed a complaint much earlier because of water quality issues,
Yeah,
which was responded to.
yeah. So we actually had this discussion and there was some, well, just add them to the list. The issue is there is no list. Each time we need to send out a notification, we will regenerate the list so that we're making sure we're catching changes. people move, sell their homes, buy whatever, we want to make sure we're getting as best we can the latest. So we generate a new list every time. So if we have someone that's just outside of that limit and have to remember, add this one, add this one, add this one, add this one, it's a danger of losing it. So we decided, at least at staff, unless the council tells us otherwise, to limit our regeneration of the list each time to 2.5 miles, and advise someone like you, if you want to be informed, check our website periodically.
But I'm already on your list of complaints, so can I not?
So that's a different,
So I can,
yeah.
so the question was, well, what if I've already filed a complaint or concern related to my well, whether it was water quality or some other reason? What happens then, Rich?
Our plan with that is to track you through until we've resolved it with you, even if it takes 1.5 years or 2 years.
I'll get notified of when
If you haven't,
everybody else is getting notified of, is my question?
not necessarily, no, because you'd be beyond that. But we're noting this, we're recording this meeting. We haven't had that conversation. How do we manage that? Because keeping track of those one-offs is risky, that we'll forget you, if I'm honest.
There also has to be just a reasonable distance limit for those notifications. The DNR felt that 2.5 miles would reasonably capture people that might potentially be at risk, and so the limit was set. If you're already on the radar, we'll resolve your issue. If you've reported something, we'll bring that to resolution. So at that point, reasonably, there shouldn't be a need to continue further because it's been resolved. But again, this is why we're making everybody aware of the city page and why we established it, so that people that are interested, for whatever reason, they can track what's going on. But it does put the burden on you to be proactive and look at that page periodically. Sir, I'm going to go with one last question in the room here, and then we're going to move to the hallway, the back room, and take a few online. So, sir.
So how did you notify the public that we're going to conduct a pump test and when we need to watch for it? So the first time,
Yeah, so there wasn't a notice for the aquifer pump test.
why was that?
There wasn't one that was required, and based on discussions of technical folks, both working for the city and for the DNR, there was no anticipation that there was going to be any issues.
I just want to ask for Trevor a question.
Excuse me, Jamie, I know, but we're working in an orderly fashion, Jamie. Can you respect the room, please?
Well, and our water got poisoned for 2 months. We went without water. That never got solved. For 2 months, over Christmas. I had
So,
no water.
so to-
manganese.
so-
Tom Terry, would you like to drink manganese? 2 months.
I grew up on a well. So here's
So
the,
you drank manganese, you wouldn't be here today. You'd
So-
be dead.
so here's the thing. Nobody anticipated this. There wasn't notice of the pumping, and there's nothing we can do retroactively. With regards to individual situations, if you've notified us, and I know you have, Jamie,
Yeah,
we are following up on it,
you haven't heard a word of
and
it.
we will follow up on it. So, have you been mailed a questionnaire requesting your problem? Then you have heard for us. So at this point, we're gonna move on to another question.
It's so sad.
We're not gonna let individuals run the meeting because we have people here that want information.
If somebody
And we're gonna ask,
dies-
Jamie,
If somebody dies, Tom Terry, think about that. Manganese is poison. Think about that.
Jamie, there are a lot of people here, I'd like you to respect their time here that have questions.
They all need to ask the same question.
And we want to get to those questions, but I can't. So let me move on to those questions and help those people, please. So, Renee, do we have anybody online that would to ask a question? If you are online and you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand virtually. If you go to the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, there will be a little heart or a reaction button. If you touch it and then hit raise your hand, it'll raise your hand. Renee will be able to see it and we'll be able to call on you.
We currently have 41 participants online, and there are currently no hands raised, but I am definitely keeping an eye out. We'll unmute you if you have your hand.
So if you
hand
do have a
raised.
question, please raise your hand online. I am going to go to the back room and then I'll circle back, ma'am. So Brandon, you are in the back room. If there's anybody in the back room that you have that has a question, could you bring them up to the front room? And so we can answer their question. I'll be in the hallway in a minute, sir. 1 second.
One clarification, when you use 2.5 and then 1.0, can you guys add the water quality or the other term that associates with both your qualifications, just to be unclear? Because
So
it's going
we,
back and forth.
yeah, so we had a request for clarification. There's the 1 mile radius for interference and the 2.5 mile for water quality. We've had a request that when we're, not to speak in shorthand, and when we're referencing those distances, apply the appropriate qualifier descriptor to it so everybody can stay clear. So Brandon, do you have questions?
Yeah, everybody with a question in the back room is sort of in front of the line here.
And how many do we have?
Roughly 5 in that room.
Okay, so we'll take 5 from the back room, and then we'll circle back to the main room. So if the first individual could come up with their question, that would be great.
All right, the question is the construction going on 2 part of your industrial water use?
So the question was, is the construction that going on County Road 2, and that would be on the east side of 35 on the south side, that is the Niagara Bottling Project that is currently under construction. And they would be the large industrial user that we're talking about. Okay, next question. Yes, sir.
Hi, Tom.
Hi, Jared.
I'm unclear now. Okay, I lift the hydrant up and no water comes out. How long does it take before I get water?
So you currently live in town, so can you elaborate on that a little
I'm on
bit?
the farm.
Okay.
I lift the handle up. I'm within a mile. I lift the handle up on the pump to water the cows and no water comes out.
Okay, I don't know the specifics. I don't know if you're having mechanical issues with your well or if it's associated with anything that we're doing.
No, I'm just saying if
Oh, hypothetically,
Okay. Rich, do you want to answer that question for Jared? And just to repeat, Jared has agricultural property south of town. He's asking the hypothetical question that once he lifts the handle on his egg hydrant, like you'd use for filling like a cattle tank or something, how long before water should start coming out?
No. If I lift it up and no water comes out,
you get,
obviously respond to you.
you call the number that we will send you before we increase our pumping.
Okay, then how long does it take for me to get water?
We have, I think we have like 24 hours to get back to you with a water supply, drinking water. And if there's cattle, we'll have to sort it out, but you call us and we're responsible to respond.
So how
Ma'am,
much
if you
water
can
would I
hold the
get?
comments, please.
Like, how much, would I get enough to fill a cattle tank, or would I just get a gallon?
We certainly can bring a water truck if we need to, but I'd rather not sort that all out at this meeting.
Okay.
Just let you know, you'll be getting,
Trying to get along, that's
yep,
all.
No,
yep.
the-
We'll send you a phone number to call.
This guy,
The-
swear to God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The specifics, I think the takeaway is that we have to respond, we will respond, but the specifics will depend on the situation of a particular property owner, in your case, your egg property.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, yep, no, it's a good question. We had 2 more, I believe. Sir, I think you were next.
Hi, my name is Dino Fontolatis. I'm a resident on the 2.5-mile radius of your response plan. So that being said, I'll be brief. I did see my water be affected as I tried to water for my animals, and I did not know what that was. I was not notified of the pump test as you provided us here with today, that information, that nobody was notified of that. So my question is, when you are responsible for testing all these wells in that perimeter, how is it that it's being tested at a time when it's not being drawn down or there's an increase in demand for those big city wells? Those tests will probably come back as possibly closer to normal when there isn't a huge demand on it. That's my question. And so, how is it that beyond that 1 mile perimeter, beyond the 1 mile interference, that when you're at 2.5 miles, you say, okay, we're gonna sample 20 wells? I would also like to know how those are identified and why they're being selected. Thank you.
Yep, so the question was, The gentleman that was mentioned, it indicated that he had had some impact to his well during the aquifer pump test. And the question was, why do we sample now when the usage is back to what it has been for the last several years or similar-ish to it, as opposed to when it's under a higher draw? And then he was asking the difference about the 1 mile radius from the city's production wells and the 2.5 mile distance from the production wells, and what's the difference about why we test and where?
So for the first question, we actually will be sampling before we begin higher pumping and during higher pumping. That's part of the plan that we have to meet. So when pumping goes up, we think next summer or maybe the summer after, depending on weather, we have to sample then as well. So we're catching that difference in pumping levels to see if there's a change in water quality. And we have to sample again after that first higher pumping goes back down. So we have to do 3 rounds to get background data. So yes, it seems silly that we'd go after the fact when things are normal, but the idea is we will, as close as we can, replicate samples again when pumping rates are high and then subside again. So I think that responds to your first part of your question.
Well, not really, because in a way, we have to be reporting data back to the DNR by December 24th. I don't remember the exact date.
The schedule for those second and third is completely based on when we're pumping that rate of water, because they know we can't predict and we can't just decide to pump that much unless we do another pump test, which I don't think anybody wants. So that part is not due before just the first round of samples is. But there will be more as we do more pumping.
And the follow-up to my second question?
So refresh me.
The second part of the question is, what is the basis for the testing geography of the 1 mile interference radius versus the 2.5 mile water quality radius?
So the thinking, at least at the time the response plans were written, is that out of water is a drawdown phenomenon. And drawdown beyond 1 mile is fairly limited, so it's unlikely to affect wells beyond 1 mile. They don't know what's causing the water quality issues, and neither do we. And so they added distance. There's much less drawdown at 2.5 miles, but it still could be something going on in that zone. As far as what criteria we have to use to choose the sample points, the DNR staff came up with that. They want a mix of spatial. They don't want them all in one area. They want them to represent neighborhoods, perhaps, rather than one well isolated a mile from anything else. They want it in different levels of the aquifers, because the aquifer consists of different layers. I talked about the Prairie du Chien in Jordan, but there are others. So they want to see, does it matter what part of the aquifer they're tapping? And there's some other criteria, but that's the difference. That's laid out by the DNR, and that's why I'd prefer that we find those wells based on that criteria rather than respond to 150 requests to use my well for sampling.
Just as a clarification, you said testing potentially summers away, but to issue a permit for Niagara to open, you have to do your pumping before that, correct? Because they're going to be drawing the water for their functionality and their business.
We would expect they'll.
Rich, if I can.
Oh, sure.
So to summarize the question for those that couldn't hear is basically the relationship of pump testing and the timing of the pump testing again relative to when we might do higher usage, which would include to a very large degree our irrigation, which is seasonal, but also adding the bottling plant on top of that.
So the pump test was a requirement by the DNR for them to consider our permit request. Limited duration, heavy pumping, short time, then done. The increased pumping will respond to the demand of not just Niagara, but our own community. So they're not going to start at 100% production. It'll be ramped up. At the same time, our community will be coming out of springtime. If it's a hot, dry year, we may be using more water. We may reach those threshold pumping levels sooner But if it's like this year, it may be later or the year after, if that helps.
Clarification was, you will issue them an occupancy and an operational permit to start working in the plant. No, just let me finish. In the plant, before you do the pump testing, or you're gonna do it simultaneously as they build up their capacity.
So the aquifer pump test is already completed and was the basis for all of this stuff.
Correct, but the functionality is not, the
But,
plant's not open yet.
but the
You have to do a
sampling,
follow-up
yeah.
plant procedure with them. I know that for a fact. So you're saying that you're gonna let them free flow, walk in and do business automatically with no testing and open the doors next May? Because you stated they'd be open probably around May. So there won't be any testing between now and May when they start their pumping.
So the question is, how does the testing timeline relate to Niagara's coming online and their volumes of usage?
So, talked about the interference plan. We have to gather all this missing and data confirmed, turn that in to the DNR in time for them to review it before pumping meaningfully increases for Niagara or city use for that matter. So that's the interference. We have to gather samples from the 20 wells meeting the criteria they dictate and approved by them and have those results in hand before that pumping begins. So that's the additional, there's no more aquifer pump testing, but those are the things we have to meet before that, yeah.
And that, just another clarification, is that just for interference, or is that for quality issues as well? Those 20 wells?
So the question is, the sampling at the 20 wells, is that for interference or is that for water quality?
So the data that we need to gather on folks' wells and pumps and water levels that they don't have, that's for interference. The sampling, the first round of sampling we have to do, that's to establish a baseline water quality before pumping increases, at which point we have to sample it again. Concurrently, we are working to respond to the complaints that we have or will receive by getting the data we can and figuring out how to analyze it. We don't have that background data now, so that's why I'm saying it's going to take some time. We may have to get that sample stuff. We may have to take samples at some or all of these wells. That hasn't been determined yet, but we do plan to process and deal with those until they're resolved.
But the 20 wells are gonna be within just the 1 mile radius? Is that
Actually, no,
So the question was, is the sampling wells, are they within the 1 mile interference radius, or are they within the 2.5 mile water quality radius?
that particular section of the plan requires those 20 wells to be within about 2 miles, is pretty much verbatim what it says.
Yep, and just to clarify, so for the well interference, you're gonna be looking at things like, what is the depth of the well? So where is it poked into? What is the depth of the pump? Those types of physical characteristics related to it, because that relates to the interference issue. The water sampling will relate to the water quality, so that will look at water constituents like manganese and iron and arsenic and things like that that are actually within the water itself.
Just to add on to Tom's, while we're strictly only required to do sampling for water quality complaints, I do plan to try and get as much well information as we can anyway, because it may be relevant or it may be useful for other things later. The city's going to keep growing. As much as we can know about these wells up front and keep building that database and share it with the DNR and share findings with you all as the city grows, the easier this is going to be.
Okay. Vita, we'll circle back to you. You had your question, but we'll give you an opportunity later if we have enough time. Gentleman there?
I have a question. So I've got correspondence on my phone with my son. My iron filter system went bananas during December, the end of November. I happen to be in Arkansas taking care of problems with my mom. My neighbor's iron filter and softener system, which they spent a ton of money on, all went down at this time, completely blocked up. How do we know this isn't gonna continue to happen as you ramp up water? How am I?
We are 3.8 miles away,
Yeah,
a stone's
and
throw
it
from
went-
Niagara.
I've got video and correspondence from my son of my water pouring just rust out, we've never had any trouble.
And here's the caveat, we're Lakeville address, but all of our neighbors are Elko. We're on the line of Lakeville, Elko in Scott County. We're like right on your very edge.
I had all this equipment built at Robert L. Hill Company up here in the Twin Cities. I drove them the water sample up when I moved down here. They built the equipment to suit this water, and now it's all plugged up.
So the question was, this couple, is they experienced water quality issues when the aquifer pump test was going on. And so the question was, what do we do, is essentially,
How
yeah.
do you cover up? We're 3.8 miles away. Are we out of luck?
So,
No.
if you have not yet notified us,
I have.
okay, so then you probably, if you haven't received a questionnaire, you will, because we just mailed them on Friday. And 2 days later, you'll get an envelope to return it in because we forgot to put that in. I apologize. And we'll take it from there. So we are dealing with those. We will be notifying the DNR of our findings, working with them through this, asking their help in figuring out, what might have caused this. We know it's related to pumping, but the mechanisms, the chemistry, the what is going on that would turn a dissolved mineral in the water into something solid that shows up in your filters just from pumping. But I'll stop there because I don't have all the answers at this point. We are committed to keep working on that.
We would simply ask that if you do have an issue, that you contact the My Private Well email. Yeah, and then we will send out a questionnaire. Answer it as thoroughly as you can. And we know that takes a little bit of time, but please do, because that will help us move through the process.
And this doesn't impact the fact that we do not have an Elko address.
Nope.
So as Rich pointed out, the 1 mile and 2.5 mile radiuses for interference and water quality is basically a mechanism to determine who starts the process. Is it the DNR or the city? There has to be a reasonable limit to that. That is just for response, not for responsibility. So if it's determined that you have an issue and it's related to our pumping, it doesn't alleviate, that barrier doesn't alleviate the responsibility. It just creates a mechanism to make it simple so people know this is where you go.
I do have somebody online that has a question.
Okay. Who is the person online?
I'll call on Jake.
Can you unmute Jake?
I'm gonna ask to unmute you, Jake, at this time.
Jake, can you ask your question, please?
Hi, this is actually Jackie, his wife. My question is, we moved in January. We bought our house in January, so we weren't living here during the aquifer testing. So we truly don't know what we're getting into and if we had any concerns while this testing was going on. You talk a lot about response time and timely responses, but what does that mean? Does that mean that there's going to be a call back within a certain amount of time? How will it be handled? I would like a little bit more detail on that.
So everybody should have been able to hear that question because it was coming from online. Rich, do you want to respond to that?
Sure. So just to let you know up front, since the pump test, the city has not been pumping extra water for any reason. We've just been doing our normal annual pumping cycle. In fact, this year pumping considerably less than we normally would because of the wet weather. So nothing has changed yet at this point. Your water, if there had been any water quality issues during the pump test in November, December, should have returned to normal. Unless there was a filter clog that they didn't correct. But if your water is acceptable now, we would expect that it will remain that way at least until sometime next year. And even then, we can't predict if a water quality will reemerge because we don't intend to turn our pumps on and let them run round the clock for 4 weeks like we did for that pump test. This will be more of a gradual thing. Whether that makes a difference, I can't tell you tonight, but it may. So we won't be replicating the pump test conditions unless at some point we have to run another pump test. Things will be more gradual and the wells will be varied so that we have try to minimize the aquifer drawdown effects, both for interference and now that we're aware of this water quality, we want to be mindful not to make huge, prolonged, sudden shifts in water levels to the extent we can. However, there may still be something. And what I would suggest to the online question, Jackie, send an email to Private Well, explain your situation briefly, give your address, and we can try to give you some more information about what we might expect at that location, because I have no idea where you moved into, how close it is, that type of thing. That would be a good start, and then if there's something we need to follow up with, we'll have a background.
She was
So-
asking about response times, how long it would take for you to
Okay,
respond.
but I don't feel like my question was fully answered
Oh,
in regards to
I'm sorry.
response time. In
So-
regards to response time, you've talked about timely response.
Yep.
But a little bit more detail on that, please.
So if you put an email into My Private Well, that could take several days for me to get to and respond to, because we're not doing anything right now that would cause any problems. So yes, you are owed a timely response. At the same time, we need to manage our time and take care of other things. When we increase our pumping, and for example, you experience an out-of-water complaint, like we talked about with Jared, I think our plan calls for an immediate response. We give you a round-the-clock phone number for that reason, and you could expect a response within a few hours and then follow up within a day or so to get you back as best we can to have at least drinking water and restore service as soon as possible. If it's a water quality complaint, that might be a little slower, but at the same time, we'd be calling you back shortly. Hopefully by then we'll know more about how this might be minimized or addressed quickly. But still, when we are actually increased our pumping and we receive a phone call to that phone number we'll provide, you could expect a response within a day.
So a couple things out of that. Jackie, Renee, who's managing our online, she will send you a chat with that email address, the myprivatewell@ci.enm.mn.us, since you're not here to get one of the blue cards that has it on it. But Rich, so just to go back, and I know you talked about in your presentation, the water quality issues that we've heard about have been almost exclusively related to the aquifer pump test. Could you review again what volume of water that was relative to what even the maximum end of our permit, which we won't be at right away, was?
We pumped between 1.2 and 1.77 million gallons a day round the clock for 2 weeks, and then 2 more weeks at the other rate. So over 4 weeks, we pumped as hard as we could, nonstop, totaling about 42 million gallons a year.
Or a month?
I'm sorry, 42 million gallons in that 4 weeks. We project if we have a dry summer next year, we would pump about 75% of that in 4 weeks with a dry year and with Niagara running full. So we don't expect to pump at the test pump rate for several years. It'll take population growth or something else to change, which is not programmed right now.
So it's not that these things we're dismissing these things, it's just realistically that the circumstances that generated the water quality issues that we're hearing about aren't likely to manifest themselves for a period of time yet.
That doesn't mean there may not be impacts, but I would expect if there are, they would be less because we'll be pumping quite a bit less, and we'll be pumping on more of a smooth up and down rather than on hard, stay on, shut off. It'll be a different circumstance, and I think there may be something related to that, the nature of the pumping that had an effect.
But this also gives us time to look at the issue.
Yes, hopefully we'll have some ideas what's going on, and if we're really lucky, we can find ways to prevent or minimize it with notice and with some hopefully simple strategies. But that's a hope. I have no answers for you tonight.
Like you said before, you don't actually know. Tom is trying to allude to that if you're not pumping, if we don't pump that hard, we won't have a problem.
Well, it stands to reason that if we're pumping less hard,
So
there'd
the
be fewer
question from the
problems.
audience was, if we don't pump as hard as we did during the aquifer test, what's the likelihood, or how does that relate to the potential for issues?
We don't know the answer to that.
Yes, you are right. We don't know the rate, the answer. We're just supposing that less pumping would be less problems.
Okay,
Well, you
so
didn't anticipate
we'll,
the problem when you had the test and you didn't notify, so I think you're short-sighted a lot.
so we'll go to questions from, back to the back room, if there's any questions from the back room or the hallway. If you could come up to the entrance to the council chambers. I have somebody in the brown coat.
Yes, hi, I'm Sarah. I live within a mile of the Niagara plant, and my question is, you've talked a lot about the 3 pump station. Are all 3 up and running? And how is Niagara getting their water? Are you drilling an additional pump that's gonna have an immediate impact as me within a mile of the Niagara plant?
So that's a really good question. There is a common misconception that Niagara has their own wells or the permitting had anything to do with Niagara with regards to that aspect. Niagara is hooked to the city system. The permit is for the city on the city's well. Niagara does not have any private wells. There are no wells on their site. All of the existing wells that we've talked about are existing wells which the city has had and has operated for years. So proximity to the Niagara plant has no impact on well interference or water quality issues related to city pumping because there is no wells that are pumping at the Niagara plant. The wells are actually located more towards the center of the city geographically, and those wells have been in place for, some of them for decades and some of them for at least a decade.
2010 was our last one.
2010 was the last one that we drilled. So that's a good question, and I appreciate it because it helps clear up that misconception.
To be clear, you are not adding one in that area.
That is absolutely positively true. We are not adding any more wells at or near the Niagara location.
But you are adding a well.
You are.
There are plans, longer term, we do need to add at this point an additional well for the city and for what, at this point, for what they call firm capacity. So that basically is a backup well in case one of your other wells goes down.
Or you shut them off. Or the city shuts them off. Then they got their well.
No, the well that we would be putting would be on the city system for people that are connected to the city system. The question was, does the new well, is it a cheat get around for Niagara if we shut off Niagara? Niagara has no wells of their own and no direct access to their own. They have one pipe in, and it comes from our wells. So we have 3 wells. The city is currently talking about constructing another well that would be connected to the city system, and that would be a backup well in case one of the other wells goes down. There are guidelines that you have to be able to provide a certain volume of water. Rich, can you give the quick formula?
Firm capacity is your capacity with your largest well out of service, just to ensure that we can serve our population with reliable water.
And fight a fire.
So,
Yep.
yeah.
So, yes, and at this point, at some point, as the city continues to grow, we may need to drill additional wells, but those would be city wells serving the city system and anybody that's connected to it, whether it's an industrial user, commercial user, a car wash, or a single-family resident, or an apartment building, or an industrial park, yep. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Cameron. I have a question about the water quality problems. I've sent you all an email about water quality issues that are concerning to me, my family, and my neighbors. And I'm curious that during this buildup and the baseline testing, you said that you might not be able to do the repeat testing for over a year after you build up pumping. In the email that I sent you, it talked about how there can be interference to wells with regards to arsenic, which is not tasteable, not smellable, and that could be in my water until you then do this repeat test, or it could be in my neighbor's well if they're one of the 20 that you pick. So my question is how are you planning to notify people of the wells that you test, whether there are changes, because I have my arsenic results from when I did a well test last year, and I'd be curious to know what your plan is to notify people. Say my neighbor has arsenic now in their water from this increase in pumping, but you don't do the repeat test for over a year. How do we know? How do I protect my family? How do I protect my neighbors? How do we protect ourselves in this situation where a rainy season like we have is going to change that value that's been proven in research. So my question is, what are you gonna do to notify all of us?
So Rich, can
about
you
changes?
can you state the question and then respond to it?
I think the gist of it is if we do our baseline sampling and find, or our second round or third round of sampling and find high arsenic, for example, at one location, would we notify others, at least in that area, if not overall, of that finding? And the plan does not require that, but it sounds like a good idea to me. And so I think we take that under advisement for, that we would broaden that notification. The other thing I'd like to, and I think Councilmember Josh, if you disagree with that, go ahead and give me a stern look, but I think it makes a lot of sense. There is nothing in the plans or in what we do that would prevent a homeowner from taking samples of their own water and having them tested as often as they wish. So that would be elective on your part. Our obligation is to the response plans and the permit, which, by the way, we don't get to choose when we do that second round of testing. It's based on when we're pumping at those minimum levels of 1 million gallons a day for 14 days. We can't even choose when that's going to happen. It's just based on demand. So yeah, it might not be this coming year. It could be, but yeah, it does have to wait for that. So I think I tried to take a crack at two parts of it. I don't know if that fully answered it, but you let us know.
So then, it's at my expense to retest my water. Are you gonna notify me when you go up? Or is it only when you start this, as you build up, and then say, I do have a water quality problem?
No, both plans require.
So if you could state the, if you
yeah.
could state the question.
I understand what you're saying, that as the water, you start your test, you're gonna tell me. Or you start ramping up pumping, you're
Yep.
gonna tell me.
Yep.
But then there's a big range that you talked about, from 1.2 to 1.7. What happens if I have a problem at 1.5? Am I gonna know that you changed something, that all of a sudden now I'm having a problem? Because you guys talked about that you were pumping way more water during this aquifer test than you will be.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
There's a big range in there that you're talking about increasing the pumping, that again, in the email that I sent you, talked about the risk of putting arsenic and manganese in the water, that all of a sudden now, I don't know that you're continuing to ramp up, and I don't know when that's gonna change or when that slows down, so how much notification are we gonna have? That's basically my question.
Can you restate the question? Could you state the question, Rich, and then answer it?
I think the question was whether and when the city would notify well owners of additional changes in pumping rates forecast beyond what's required for the first ramp up, the first year, and future ramp up. So there's no requirement for additional notifications. Whether we do that, we've not discussed, but I would expect that our ramp up will be annual. You can expect that it's going to increase in the summers along with our irrigation use. That's what's going to drive those peaks more than anything, and subside in the fall and winter. So it'll be cyclical. So you can expect it'll go up and down, summer higher, winter lower, summer higher, winter lower. If there is more growth and another permit is required, we go through all this again, the conditions may change, there may be more required notifications. And I'm not saying we wouldn't, we haven't discussed whether we would do additional or a seasonal or an annual notification. Oh, things are back down, you're good till, April. Oh, things are going back up, hang on to your hats until, September. I don't know if we're gonna do that. But you can expect that that's what would normally happen after that first year, after the plant is up and running, and following the seasonal patterns that we've always seen here in the city.
So then just to finish, like you're going to talk about notifying neighbors.
We're going to talk about notifying neighbors of, we find a problem at one house, let's tell everybody. Or, yeah. Yep. Yep. No, I think that makes a lot of sense.
So,
Somebody dies for.
so I'm gonna call for questions. We still don't have any online. I wanna make sure they have an opportunity to participate. We just took some from the back room, so I think we'll circle back. I wanna take a question from somebody that hasn't asked one yet. Jonathan?
Yep, so, there's a question right at the end of this, but I wanna establish a few things and correct any of the facts you hear if you think they're wrong. So from the data Renee shared, the permit, the increase that's been granted was primarily to supply Niagara, which would accelerate probably average or normal groundwater use by potentially decades. Niagara is recruited to come here, subsidized to come here, and in a previous question you clarified, they have no financial responsibility to address interference or quality, not the DNR, not the county, not the state. The city and the city alone is financially responsible for this. Then you shared tonight that you were surprised that the pump test had any impact, and we've heard of interference problems, we've heard of quality issues up 3+ miles away. And we've heard there's at least 1,000 wells within 2.5 miles. I don't know how many more that adds when you start going further out. So I'm very concerned about the financial capability of the city to respond to the interference and quality complaints that are already on your doorstep. And now just a whole new, 1,000+ well owners have now just become aware that they're at risk. And now you're getting questions about testing. So how much money has the city already specifically earmarked to fix, not the $100 or a couple $100,000 to run this testing plan, but how much money has the city specifically set aside to fix interference and quality issues?
At this point, we don't have a specific budget for it. I can tell you that the amount of revenue, so keep in mind that this permit serves not only in Niagara, but it also serves the growth within the community. And the amount of revenue that it generates provides the ability to pay for a substantial amount of work if it is required to address any well interference. Now, so far, there hasn't been an indication that there's a significant well interference issue. The water quality issue, we are looking into it. We have not seen any substantial evidence to indicate that water quality issues or anything other than interim at this point related to the aquifer test. However, that's indicative and we need to get to the bottom of that. We need to find out what happened, and if there were people that were impacted by it, we do need to address it. The reality is, at some point, whether it's 5 or 15 years from now, we will be pumping these same volumes. Those same wells will still be there, and these issues would arise at that time if they are issues that are occurring today. The difference is there would be a large commercial or industrial, in this case, industrial user to help absorb the cost rather than putting that cost on all of the residents.
Yeah, just since you mentioned the revenue thing, just one follow-up comment. You've already laid out, you can go back and look in the records, there's already been a $2 or $3 million investment to get water out there. You'll probably need to make another $8 to $9 million of investment in another water tower, another pump, potentially expanding the water treatment plant.
Yep.
So I would want everybody to pay attention. You're gonna get about $1 million of revenue and you're gonna invest $10 million. How many of you are willing to make that investment? Because that's what the city is investing.
Yeah.
So that's not a question, but you did raise the point, so I would like to address that.
Sure.
So at some point, we will need to build another water tower. It's inevitable. At some point, we will need to add additional wells. It's inevitable. At some point, we will need to add capacity to our water treatment facility. It's inevitable. The difference is when I build a water tower that's gonna meet our needs and our needs into the future, that water tower, let's say, I'm just gonna pull numbers out of the air, these aren't the actual numbers, is gonna serve an additional 5,000 homes. I have the risk that I need those 5,000 homes to get built to pay for that. We have to front the cost from a cash flow standpoint. There is less risk to our ratepayers on our system if we have somebody on the system that already has large revenue. That type of revenue helps us pay for those large pieces of capital infrastructure with less risk, because we still need to build those, whether it's homes or a restaurant or an apartment building or a large industrial user or a car wash. Whatever it is that adds up to a volume of water, you're still gonna have to build the same infrastructure to provide that same amount of water. If it's all residential, you're gonna have to put the risk of building that infrastructure, because you don't build it for what you need today because you already needed it. You build for what's coming in the future. You're already maxed out. You have that risk of needing to have that all come. When you have that large industrial user, that provides a cash flow today at one time that makes things work. Anybody that's worked in a business understands the value of having that large customer that comes in today versus building that customer base over a long period of time, and how that relates to building the infrastructure necessary to serve those customers. So yes, having a large user will accelerate when we need to do those items by 5 or 7 years or so, maybe even 10.
Leads in 5 years, and now we're stuck with the bill.
Because what if they ban plastic water bottles?
What about lawsuits? I mean, seriously, if
So-
people don't have water, they're gonna sue.
So I'm gonna move on, because we are going down a rabbit hole, and the purpose tonight was for well owners. And most of the well owners don't live in the city limits, and they may not give a rat's ass about how it gets paid for. They want to know about how the impact of their well is. So let's move on to the things that impact them. So I'm gonna call on people that haven't asked a question yet tonight, the gentleman back there in the gray shirt.
Is Niagara in the city limits?
It is,
It is, so I annexed that property?
correct.
When did we get a notice of that? Because that's my neighborhood now.
Anybody that was in 350 feet wouldn't have been noticed going through the zoning. That is what statutory, yeah. So again, tonight's meeting is not about any zoning issues or construction issues. This is about wells and impacts to wells, and Niagara doesn't directly impact anybody's wells. So I had another hand raised over here. Yes, sir, I don't think you've had an opportunity to ask a question yet tonight.
I did not have any idea this testing was going on, I didn't know anything about this, but I do know that for the month of November through December, I had little to no water. I had a well guy come out, and I had plumbers come out, which I had to pay to try to figure out why I had no water. I got no idea this was going on. But anyway, at the end of the day, when this all takes place, apparently I'm gonna have an interference problem, because it sounds like I'm going to. What am I gonna have to do to correct that? Am I gonna have to sink my well deeper? Who's gonna pay for that? I'm gonna pay for that, or what's gonna happen?
Okay, so the question, and I'm going to summarize it a little bit. We have a gentleman in the audience who says he experienced what appeared to be interference issues during the aquifer test, and his question,
Water quality issues too,
and water quality
smelled
issues.
like it was coming from a sewer.
Yep, and so the question is, he incurred some expense to address the issue at the time, and it indicates that there might be issues going into the future. So the question is, how does that get addressed?
So if you've not notified the DNR or us,
I got the information now, I will do that.
do that, and we'll take it up from there.
But in the future, am I gonna have to, or somebody, in order to fix it, are we gonna have to sink the well deeper, or what's gonna happen?
We expect, as I said during the presentation, we don't expect to have to drill new wells or drill wells deeper, because they already have to be of such a depth to get to the water. Most of the time, these types of issues will be addressed by lowering the pump in the well, by adding additional drop pipe. That's not universally true. I don't know the situation for yours, but send us your information and we'll get it rolling to figure out what's going on at yours. And if we can address it now and it's because of our pumping, it may avoid the need to do anything in the future because you've already taken care of it.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Is there anything in a water quality test or in some of these, is there any kind of a water quality problem that would change your course of action, that would change what you're doing? If you found a bunch of arsenic, if you found really high levels, let's say you found really high levels of arsenic in a lot of the wells, is that gonna change what's gonna happen? Is that gonna change Niagara? Is that gonna change, is DNR gonna change something? Is anything in water quality gonna change any course of action? Or is it all just, we're just gonna placate you and hope things get better and assume there's not gonna be a problem?
So the question is there anything that might come up in the findings when we get into the water quality testing that might change the conditions of our permit? I think the first thing we have to point out is whatever we find would have to be directly related to the city's pumping. So if there's already a background high level of arsenic or manganese that's just specific and already there that isn't directly related to the city's pumping, then probably no. But if it is directly related to the city's pumping, that's the whole reason that we're providing the information back to the DNR so that they can compile it. I guess the answer would be we don't know. It would depend, it's one of those open-ended questions. It would depend very specific on what the findings are, and it would be up to the DNR to determine what the results of that might be.
Could I just add on to that too? I mean, so I think it's not just the DNR, it's MDH that is also involved in this process, especially from the water quality perhaps issue side of things. And within the significant user agreement that the city has with Niagara, there is an out for the city if, you know, concerns are raised by MDH or DNR or some other entity that then, you know, finds significant issues. The DNR, MDH could say, no, we can't approve or we can't go forward with what was laid out in the appropriation permit. There could be conditions perhaps that they would then deem on us that then they would tell us, no, we can't do it. But then the nice thing about that from a city perspective is we're not on the hook to Niagara because they're fully at risk now for continuing to build, develop, to turn on this system. And ultimately, if these tests come back to show significant issues that MDH or DNR say are there or could be there, we might not be able to turn it on. Am I correct in my assumption of some of that?
Yeah, so for those that are not in the room, Councilmember Berg happens to be with us this evening, and
Is he on a well? Are you on a well?
It's a public meeting.
Oh, I thought it said on the thing for well owners.
well, I would think, Jamie, that since we're holding a city meeting, that our boss or one of our bosses could be here. So the question or the response basically indicated, and I go back to your original question. What's your name, ma'am?
Brenda.
Brenda had asked, and I'm going to summarize. Has the train left the station? Is there any way that you can back up the train at this point now that Niagara has a building permit and they're building and the DNR has issued this permit? The reason that the DNR has us do this testing is to see if there are potentially any issues. Our agreements with the large industrial user provide us, have circuit breakers in there. So it's dependent upon our permit. If the DNR modifies our permit such that we cannot provide them water, they're aware of that. It's part of the agreement, significant industrial user agreement that we have with them. Now somebody's going to say, well, how is that any different from our homeowners? In our agreement and also in our ordinance, we prioritize domestic water use above everything else, above irrigation, above commercial use, above industrial use. They're further down the ladder. If we ever get into a situation as a community that our water availability becomes constrained, there are state rules, we have our own water plan, and we have our own ordinances, and we have our agreement structure to match that place domestic water use as a priority over those other uses. Does that answer your question, ma'am? Okay.
Even if that domestic water use isn't from the city, if it's a well outside city limits.
So we're talking about, the question I think Brenda had was, can we turn off the spigot to Niagara if we have to?
Yep.
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted the question, but I'll
Yep.
rephrase it. So you prioritize domestic water use over top your industrial users. Those are wells who are not on your city system. Are we a part of that prioritization or not?
So it would be part of the DNR's prioritization. So the question was, if there's an issue with city water usage, how does that get prioritized against private well users? They're not connected to the system. Are they just out of luck? Are they out of distance or whatever? So that's part of the system. If you step back and look at the entire presentation tonight related to the permit and the water response plans, it basically comes back to the fact that if the city is, through its pumping activities, impacting your well, we have to correct the situation. So if you are out of water, we have to address it. In most cases, if it's a well interference, we have to pay for the cost to drop the pump. If it's an issue of water quality, we have to determine if we are the cause, take a look at the specifics, and then help address that issue. I think where you're going is one step beyond that. I don't think we would get to a point where all of a sudden everybody's out of water, because in most cases there is a corrective action item for it. If it's well interference, you can drop the pump. If it's a water quality, we can do something. And the one thing to keep in mind is when we issued the building permit to the large industrial user, we all of a sudden didn't start pumping 365 million gallons. We're pumping actually less than we did last year. There's a ramp-up period over time, both with normal city usage. Now, granted, when the industrial user comes online, there's going to be a big jump, and then there'll be some ramp-up after that. But that hasn't started, and they're construction project, when it comes to completion, they're not projected to actually start pumping any production water, having pallets of water bottles coming off the line until end of first quarter next year. So there's a period of time between now and then there's gonna be a ramp-up period after that. So it's not gonna be just a flip the switch kind of thing.
End of first quarter next year, that would be January, February, or March?
March, end of March,
25?
correct.
So then you're moving up the timetables is what you just said versus what he said, which was gonna be
No.
second this spring.
They don't
to
start
May.
wide open. They start, they have all new equipment, they're working out bugs, then they ramp up after they get, so he's talking about first shippable pallet, not full
I know,
production.
but you guys have sat down and looked at the production and estimated where the water usage is by
Yes, sir.
month.
Yes,
You
sir.
guys know those facts. So you're gonna know where your testing phases are gonna be for those productions. I'm from the business owner, so
Yep.
I'm talking
Yep.
logistics.
You're-
So you've talked about all that, so I understand that.
Yeah.
When we're talking in these rooms, the general public needs to
Yeah.
understand, you know what the production's gonna be, which means you know the testing timelines in between to manage that production. You know when
Yes.
the minerals and other things are being tested and adjusted.
We can estimate it.
Things like that.
No, that's fair. So the question was, how well can we guess when these things are gonna happen? We can talk to Niagara, they can provide us information based on other plants and other markets, what they anticipate the ramp-up is gonna be, but it's gonna depend heavily on the specifics of the ramp-up on this plant and what their customer market looks like here. We can take a look at probably the biggest variable, because as a production plant, even though they'll have a ramp-up period, their usage is relatively steady over time. The fluctuation on the system actually comes with lawn irrigation within the community. We see heavy spikes, and it's heavily dependent upon season and upon weather conditions. So when Rich has previously talked about, we would anticipate that we would get to this next threshold of testing next year. That's based on an assumption of a
normal
drier summer, plus what we are projecting from Niagara as well, on top of that, to be able to hit those thresholds at that point in time. It may not materialize if it's a really wet year or they don't ramp up as fast. And that also assumes that they're peaking during that season. It's possible we just may not hit that threshold within the next warm weather season, and it might take until the following year. Vita, you've been waiting patiently to ask another question.
You had mentioned that you weren't expecting any water interference or quality issues with your increased water test, with any pumping. Therefore, you didn't let the public know what was going on. And you also mentioned that, I remember at the meeting, you said there were less than 10 complaints that you knew about.
At that point,
At that point, and now we're up over 50. And we just learned more tonight, where people as far away as 3 miles away have issues. So I was also at the meeting where Dr. Carrie Jennings, well-known geologist, presented findings to tell you that the geologic maps for Dakota County are very poor, are not complete, and that her findings with glacial geology was that there very likely is a connection, that confined bed you showed us on your graphic was not so confined, and that there would be places where the quaternary soil, the quaternary layer, which has high arsenic, high manganese, and can be mobilized by this, that there was an issue there. So, you're saying you didn't know, and what I'm saying is, I think you should have taken those warnings more seriously and let the public know. And I just got a mailer in my P.O. box from the city that was all about this project. And instead of coming clean with the public and telling them the entire story, everything in that flyer was about the benefits of Niagara.
So Vita, that presentation to the city council that you mentioned, my recollection, now it has been over a year, was that she was talking about those granular veins actually having impact on surface waters. Not necessarily the issues, it might have been part of it, but my recollection is the push at that time was that it had an impact on potentially the Vermilion River and other surface waters, especially to the east of the city, was the gist of that presentation.
But my question is,
So what is the question, I guess?
please let the larger public know what is going on. Dr. Jeff Broberg, I submitted testimony to you from him. You wouldn't let me speak, but I gave it to you at the meeting,
has said that because we're talking about this quaternary later, when you increase pumping, you may have problems with your city well too. It may be your city well users in the future that are gonna have issues, not just us out in the new market.
So the question is, how do we let the larger public know?
Please,
Well,
I would
so
like you
that,
to tell the whole story.
it may be self-evident, but that was the whole purpose of the meeting tonight. We notified proactively, because there wasn't a requirement for this, and we felt it was appropriate to give people a heads up about what was going on, to answer information, and hopefully dispel some misinformation that's been put out there related to the topic in general. And so that was the purpose for tonight. And so we notified everybody within 2.5 miles related to it. And we can there can be a discussion about whether or not there should be large information. But we're also taking the information that was presented tonight, we're putting it on our website. We'll be promoting the fact that we have this site on social media and our city newsletter. Although for that standpoint, our city newsletter goes to largely city residents who are on wells. So putting it on social media and things like that will be important now that we have that page up. So thank you for that question. Does anybody else have a question tonight? Ma'am, you've been waiting patiently and have not asked a question yet tonight.
I live just past the 2.5 miles south of the area in a neighborhood of 50 homes. And the little baby here tonight that had to go home to bed experienced bathwater problems during that testing. They could see the water changing. We are out of the notification zone. I've been told we're responsible for checking the website, finding out. I was trying to find out about this meeting tonight. I had to call in to talk to Renee today, because when I checked your city calendar, which was all I knew, I didn't know about this website. It's not listed.
The website just went live today, so, yeah. Nope, this calendar, this wasn't a general, this was intended specifically for private well owners, a resident that is in town connected to city water. And not all of our meetings go on the city calendar. Generally, they're gonna be normal public meetings like commissions, council, and those types of meetings. So it's not, it is, the public is welcome to attend, but the invitations were sent to individuals. So,
I realize
yeah,
that now.
yeah.
But if I hadn't been proactive, I would have never known. And our neighborhood is being affected. And yet, prior to this meeting, I wanted to ask, is the city being proactive to any of these well owners? I'm hearing reactive. When wells dry up.
I can take that.
They have to prove it, and then you respond.
So the,
I haven't heard any proactive to help.
so the question is, what is the city doing proactively for well owners? And I'll have, Rich wants to respond to that.
I guess I heard a different question, the 2.6, and what is the city doing for that? And for complaints related to the test pumping, we have turned away no one, regardless how far they are. So have you submitted a complaint on that to us?
That was my question.
Okay.
What are you doing to help these people now? I hear you have no budget. I hear people have to submit their problems, wait for approval.
Yeah.
We need to bring them drinking water, but they need to bathe, they need to do laundry. You can't fix that.
What happens when their animals die? My dogs died magically during the pump test. The last one woke up, he was gone. Perfectly healthy dog. And then 20 days later, the other one can't even walk, paralyzed, had to carry her into a vet. How do you monetize livestock and animals? I mean, if you take a child's pet, both of them, I'm still waiting on my water tests.
Yeah.
I mean, this reactive stuff has got me so fired up.
Okay. Rich, do you want to finish responding to that question?
Well, I guess I'm not sure I understand it. We are taking complaints. We have no other way to know if something happened at a particular well.
But you're not offering
So those are all possible fixes, but we first have to get the information, which we're still getting complaints. Apparently, I would expect I'll get another batch tomorrow in the email. Then we have to follow up. We're not going to respond onesie twosie. We want to know, look at all of these together, see what the commonalities are, figure out what's going on. That doesn't mean we're not doing nothing, but it may not be as soon as you'd hope. But we will be following up, trying to resolve all of these, whether it's a quality complaint or an out-of-water complaint, and which, like I said earlier, until tonight, I knew of one, and now there's apparently 3, and I haven't seen them yet. We have no choice but to be reactive to something that's already happened. That doesn't mean we can't do what we can to make it right. It may not be perfect.
We don't know that.
But you're not giving an option to be proactive in your reach of what could happen. You don't know what's gonna happen, you don't know if anything's gonna happen. We're looking for something that you wanna reach out and assist us, not just react to a complaint, not to react to an issue. You know, is there gonna be an option where we can bring water in to have water testing done proactively to know what we're getting into as everything ramps up?
So proactivity requires knowledge, it requires more information, so you know what to do proactively. So part of what we're doing right now is getting more information. If there's information that indicates that there's additional or other things that we can or should be doing, those would be strategies that we would look at that time. But right now, we're not pumping more water. And we have work that, but we will be, but we also will be doing some of this work. But, ma'am, please, but we also will be doing the testing and gathering information between now and then. That's the whole purpose of the response plan, so we will have more information to be able, being proactive, because we're looking to see what might happen by doing testing. Other questions? Dawn?
You have Niagara coming in, and they'll be making profits right off the bat, and you have other businesses in this community that are in wetland, that hasn't, well, we've talked about agriculture.
Yep.
That's very important, but there are businesses on well also. What happens if they have a loss? Do they get reimbursed for loss of productivity or operations, or what happens to current businesses?
So we would take a look at that. So the question would be, what's the likelihood that something will happen? We do know that there has been impacts to some wells. We need to take a look at that and see why. Was it proximity? Was it the depth of the well? What were the specifics on it? So that's part of the work that we're doing. And I do want to try and create this. Everybody goes Niagara. Let's substitute Niagara for 1,500 homes. So let's say we have a large developer, M&I Development is coming to town and they're building 1,500 homes. The net effect on water usage is the same. A developer's making money off of it. They pay fees. They pay substantial fees. They pay the same base fees that everybody else in town pays, which is the largest portion of the water portion of your bill. They got no cut, no basis on, they got no reduction on that. They are paying a substantial amount of money. Those dollars can be used to address issues that might come up through the process. That type of a user on the system also puts us in a position to be able to control the rates for our businesses and our homeowners that are connected to the system. But that doesn't affect you and Jeff. You guys are on your private well with regards to your business. So the purpose for the meeting tonight and being proactive is letting you know that this information is out there, let you know what's coming down the road, let you know what you should do if you see anything or have seen something on your well so that we can respond to it. As Rich has indicated, our responsibility under state rule and state statute and under our permit, which includes the response plans, is if there's something with the city's pumping that impacts your well, we have to correct it and we have to restore it. Have you guys had any issues with regards to your well serving your business up until this point?
Well, if we would have known about the pumping issue, we would have talked to all the tenants beforehand to have them monitor, you know.
We have water quality issues.
Yeah.
Okay.
But well, if we would have talked to our tenants beforehand, I mean, for them to think back, you know, how many months before as to what had impacted them. You know, we don't know at this time.
No question. So how many, when you talk about if we have a problem, right? And you talk about you'll handle the complaints, how many staff members do you have to do that? Is it gonna fall on you and Rich to do it all? Cause this sounds like it could be massive. So who's all gonna help you guys?
So we have retained Bolton and Mink. They have people within their firm that have been assigned to this, both to take the incoming emails, send out the questionnaires, compile the information, follow up. Zach, who I introduced earlier on, I don't know if you guys saw him, he's waving from the hallway. He's gonna be the field coordinator for this, so he'll handle a lot of the day-to-day as far as coordinating the testing and some of that information. There are other technical people within Rich's firm that are handling sending stuff out, collecting the information, compiling it, logging the databases associated with it.
So did they get paid like $150, $175 an hour? Rich?
I had a glib remark, but we do charge for our services, yes.
I knew it was a lot,
Yeah.
yeah. Wow.
Yes, sir.
All right. During the presentation, I thought it was clear, but then I find out we're all on wells. Is there reasoning why the sample testing is just gonna be on the city water mains?
Oh, no, I don't know if I misspoke. No, the sampling that we're required to do will be from private wells. But only 20, and only 20 that meet certain criteria set forth by the DNR. Yeah, we don't need to test our water, we do that every day. But this will be testing from private wells representative of the different conditions that are out there. So it should give a pretty good base, if all the results come back the same, you can be assured you're kind of all getting the same water. We don't know what to expect from that. I would guess there won't be a lot of variability, but it's a guess. So we have to do it and see what we come back with. But it'll be from private wells, representative of the conditions throughout the 2.5 mile or 2 mile radius that the DNR asked for.
You've been looking like you've had a question for a long time, sir.
So you mentioned that you've established some sort of plan if one were to experience any sort of disruption with their well.
Yes.
How long is this plan good for?
Forever.
It runs with our permit, so until we get a new permit with possibly new conditions, this plan applies.
And it's unlikely that the conditions we have will be reduced. They may apply additional stuff in the future. This is my speculation. So take it for what it's worth and for what it costs you guys to get it, so to speak. If you look at what the DNR is putting together, a lot of the requirements in our current permit are towards building a database. I believe that the DNR is positioning themselves to be able to look going forward to make sure that they have a good database so that they can do even better analysis going forward. Because logically, as Renee indicated, the city is expected to continue to grow. At some point in the future, the city will likely request another amendment to its permit. The more information that we can gather related to what's going on with regards to wells and aquifers and things like that, identify where there might be risk so that we can prepare for it proactively, is what we're doing. And so I think that's why the DNR is putting a lot of this in place for us currently, even before they and if you recall from Rich's brief review of the plans, there's a lot of data gathering that we need to do before we can go to certain benchmarks for additional pumping. I don't know if that answers your question, sir.
For the most part, yeah.
Okay. Janelle.
So a couple things, if I'm not mistaken, you have on deck the next amendment to the appropriations permit, that would maybe come next year, that the city is already talking about going to the DNR for an additional permit because Niagara will need an additional 155 million gallons, which isn't covered under this permit. Is that accurate?
Yes and no. So it's reasonable to assume that we will, provided that there's nothing that comes out under our current permit that would prohibit or dissuade us from wanting to seek an additional permit, it's reasonable to assume that we will request an additional permit.
Next year, I heard 25.
So we have sized our current permit intentionally. It was sized so that we would have to go get a permit amendment before Niagara could go to its any future phases of expansion. The timing of that is, so that's a fair assumption, that when Niagara wants to go do future phases, they will have to come to the city and request it. The rumor that, oh, we're coming next year, the timing of that is unknown. We haven't even had formal discussions with our council on that, although we have talked about it conceptually, that if Niagara was going to do future phases, we would probably have to amend the permit. The council's well aware of it. We've had those discussions going back
And their
a long
current
time.
intention is to put phase 2 on in 2025, is that correct?
That is not correct. They have not approached us with any specific timing for a
But have
phase
they
2.
talked about it?
Of
So
cour-
they maybe haven't talked, they haven't
Of
approached
course,
you.
they have, they have,
talked
t-
about bringing phase 2 on in 2025.
no, they have not.
They have never mentioned it ever.
No, they have talked about phase 2. They know their ability to do phase 2 is dependent. So regardless of what they want to do, they can't do phase 2 until we amend the permit. There is also potentially additional capital improvements that we might have to do for phase 2. So those are all dependent.
A tower, which if I'm not mistaken, from the city council meetings of September.
So I'll have Rich talk about the need for infrastructure, but the point is that, yeah, it's reasonable to assume they're up front, they at some point are gonna wanna move their facility out to full, let me finish, Janelle, please. They'll wanna move their facility out to full projection. There's never been any secret about that, they've been very upfront about it.
I just want you to, I want the people here to hear that.
They've indicated that, yes, they wanna move forward at some point.
I just want the general community to hear that.
Oh, there's,
Because most people don't know that the first permit covered 155
Mhm.
million gallons for Niagara.
correct.
And the amendment that will come soon will be another 155 million. So I don't know how much more the city will bake in, but currently the city is using 135 million gallons. You baked in 75 million for growth in the permit, which states for the next 10 years. That's what the permit stated. And Niagara will have 310 million if you go for that if they go for that second phase. Just so that people understand that about 2/3 or, a little bit give or take of the city's permit will be going to Niagara. That's the point I'm trying to.
The current permit?
No, when they go on to get.
So we don't have a timeline.
You get the point, Tom.
Well, if the,
A lot of the water that's going to be used out of the city's permit will be going to Niagara.
yeah,
At the
proportionately.
expense of the township residents.
That is,
And the
that's an
growth
opinion.
that would typically, of 1,500 homes, I just want to speak to this because you keep going back to it.
Yeah,
1,500 homes would happen over the course of 10 or more years at the rate that things have currently been going at, not at the rapid speed of 2 years.
there's no dispute that if it was residential growth, and I want to be clear, and I don't think that's in dispute or there's anything misleading about that.
I'm just trying to clarify.
So what is the question, Janelle?
Well, that was just a statement. My question was, is the city talking about another amendment to the appropriations permit to satisfy Niagara's needs?
We anticipate that we will have to apply for another permit in the future. The timing for that, quite honestly, is unknown, and we've had no formal discussions with our council about it, although the council is fully aware, because this was discussed back when we have been going through the process, that the permit, it's been on record for a long time, that we can only go so far with this permit. But the timing is unknown. We don't know. If,
And Rich, I have a second question for you, or a suggestion. Or a question and a suggestion. Have you talked to the local well companies, Bond, Hartman, Jayco, about how many well interference and water quality issue complaints that they received over the course of November and December of this year?
So I've become quite good, well, repeat the question. Have I talked to the local well drilling companies? And I think in particular about how many water quality issues and interference. And so,
In November and December of this year.
so I have become pretty good pals with Jill. However, we have not talked about numbers of interference or quality complaints. We have talked about ideas related to it. We've talked about ideas for trying to sort out. We have even talked about accompanying them on a well pull to observe what they're seeing. We've talked about what records they have, quite good apparently.
I'm suggesting it because of the question that this lady asked about being proactive.
Yep,
Those well companies have a lot of information.
absolutely.
About what happened to the local wells around here.
I've also learned that they are exceedingly busy,
It's not easy to get water.
and that they get out of water complaints almost daily and treat those as emergencies, and none of those have anything to do with us. They have a huge territory. So there's some concern about scheduling and dealing with that, and we'll just have to take that up when we get to it. But no, we've been building a relationship, especially with Hartman. They tend to be in this area the predominant.
Vaughn and Jaco are all people that I've spoken
Yep,
to, community
yep,
members, they
yep.
use all three of them.
Yeah, I haven't gotten out to Bon or Jaco yet. I have heard from my friend Jill. There are some I may not want to talk to, but I'll leave that between her and me.
I just want to verify, are there any questions from the back room? Is there anybody left in the back room? Just Jared? Okay, so, just so everybody's aware, we're all the chickens that are still here, so to speak. So, we can continue to spend time on questions. So I would like, and we don't have any online, so right now it's just the room. Is there any additional questions that anybody has at this point? Yes, ma'am.
I just have a question, and it's a curiosity question on my own part, but is anybody who's been in any of these decision-making places on a well? It popped in my head, I've lived in Elko, New York my entire life. My father has lived nowhere else. We have seen so many stuff that most of the time I don't come to these because I know it doesn't matter. And I even try and calm my father down and say, don't go, Dad, because it's just going to make me like whatever. But in my head right now, as a person who's lived here my whole life, I'm like, is anybody who's making these decisions even on a well? Because I've been on my whole life. And I know that like when whatever, during that time, I had to call and get somebody out to help my parents with their well, you know, and we're whatever. Is anybody in these decision makers? Just for clarity, just because I want to know. I don't know if you guys want to know, but
So
I want to know.
that's,
Is anybody who's made all these decisions, are any of you
so
on a well?
that's a fair curiosity question of basically, does anybody have any well experience? So,
Yeah.
So right now, realistically, to be on the council who makes the decisions, you have to live in the city limits.
Right, but are any of them on a well?
Their overwhelming vast majority of housing in the city are on city water. So I'm not aware of any council people that are on a well.
When we built ours, the city didn't have a way to get us water.
Yeah.
Didn't have a way. We were like, okay, we were like, okay. So we couldn't get sewer or water.
Where are you?
I am 26510 Woodcrest Lane.
Oh,
When we
yeah,
built
yeah,
our house, the
yeah.
city had a road going through it, but my parents had owned it my whole life.
Mhm.
So you had no way.
That's right.
We had a way. We had people come out, but the city wasn't cool with it. We were fine. We did it ourselves.
Yeah.
So we did we had, our own. So I've been here a long time. I've seen a lot of stuff. And that's why I was just like, and I get it. I could run for council myself. I could whatever. I don't feel myself. I have the knowledge. I have a master's degree, but it's not in city planning or like whatever. So I get it. It's my fault. I didn't whatever too. I just in my head went, do any of these people like know what it's like?
Well, I don't vote.
Without all these
Yeah.
well people, this city wouldn't have existed. These are the people who started it, whose generations, whose families grew up. Like my kids live here, and my daughter intends to buy her house, and I am now actually thinking, I don't think I want you to, sweetheart, because I want my granddaughter to not have to worry about if she can take a bath or drink water. Sorry, that's too far.
Okay.
I just wanted to know. Are
I
they
just,
on a well?
yeah.
Do they-
I just want to add that I don't vote, but I'm on a well, and I understand what it's like to be on a well every day, to change filters, to have manganese fill up your bathtub after your filters change. I have 4 times the level of arsenic in my well. I have an arsenic filter.
Right, but did it happen during those 2 months, like it did for most of us?
No.
No,
Well, that's just a regular part of living on a well for me.
So to answer the question, no council members who are the one that make the vote live on a well, to just end it.
And again, I say,
But,
I could run
but,
myself,
but
so I
for
need to just-
purposes of, is there any understanding and sympathy, actually, a significant number of city staff either grew up on a well or currently live on a well. So we have understanding of wells, grew up on them, know well characteristics, had to deal with iron, had to deal with manganese, had to deal with changing filters, had to deal with the impact it has on your softening system and other treatments. So we have an understanding of it, so it's not like we're completely immune to the understanding of what it is like to live on a well, if that's the gist of the question. But no, none of our council members currently are well owners because there are proportionately not that many wells left in the city.
My son bought a house in the city, and he's on city, and he asks me every time, how much is your water bill, Mom? And I'm like, "Ooh, I bet it doesn't."
Coincidentally, having a large industrial user on the system,
So, Tom,
no, that's fine.
I think I know the answer, but I want to make sure that I'm not missing a request to extend city water through Woodcrest.
That's my father talking, cold and hell. I don't want sewer, sewer would be pumped up to the highest point of the county.
Thank
Rich,
you.
Vikings will win the Super Bowl before that happens. Do we have any other questions out there? Yes, ma'am.
Why is it that Niagara is gonna get such a cut rate? They're gonna get to pay so much cheaper than, I mean, I get they use a lot, but, you know, they're gonna take our resource, and so they get an extra discount for that, huh?
So we are here tonight to talk about private wells. But since we're kind of grinding down to the end, and I think we're just asking questions to ask questions at this point, I would be happy to answer that. So overall, Niagara, there's this thing that Niagara's getting this awesome deal. So, ma'am, are you on city water? I'm assuming not, since you're at the meeting tonight. So let's talk about city water bills and how they're structured. And
They're really high here.
well, if you want to let me answer, ma'am, I can. So the water bills that we have, there's two parts to your water bill. There's what's a base fee, and the base fee covers, let's just generically call it, things that are fixed costs on the system. Then there's a user fee. So this is you pay so much per 1,000 gallons of water that you use. And that fee is intended to cover operational costs, basically the cost of producing, treating, and delivering the water to your house. When you look at our water bills, for most homeowners, that base fee is the significant portion of their water portion of their utility bill, because there's also street lights and sewer and things that are on there. So for us, on their water bill, they might have a water portion of their bill that the base fee might be 2/3 of the cost of their bill. When we have commercial users, whether it's a restaurant or a school or an apartment building, we break that base fee charge that we would charge a normal homeowner is 1 unit. We calculate for those other users who are bigger how many units they are. So let's say you're Quick Trip and you have a car wash. The car wash equates to the equivalent of X number of homes. If you're an apartment building, their usage equivalent equates to X number of homes. If you're the school, it equates to X number of homes. I can just tell you off the top of my head, it's 52. I can tell you that for Eagleview over here. So they get charged the same dollar amount per base fee unit that the homeowner is, and it's calculated relative to their usage. So Niagara, Phase 1, has been calculated to be equivalent roughly to about 1,500 homes. So they pay on full usage, once they're fully ramped up in Phase 1, they're gonna pay about 1,500 base fees. So they're paying proportionately the same amount that a homeowner is on their base fees. Where people talk about they got a deal is we do charge them less for the usage fee, which remember is the minority portion of most people of the utility bill. That portion is based on the cost of delivery. They did get a break on that, and it's proportional to the efficiency of the economy of scale. When you have a user, I have 1,500 homes in the community right now. That's 1,500 water bills. That's tens of miles of pipe. That's I don't know how many hydrants I have to maintain. And meters that we have to maintain. And all those bills and all that goes to maintaining 1,500 homes versus one pipe, 1 meter, 1 bill, 1 customer. Now, they're a little more hands-on. But that pipe doesn't serve, that's a good question, but it doesn't serve just them. It serves everything between here and there as well. So from that economy of scale, yeah, they did get a break for that economy of scale that they provide, and it's proportionate. But for the things where there isn't efficiencies, for the base fee, they pay the same. The other break that they got is related to the development fees that they have to pay. When you have somebody come in and build, they have to pay connection fees, and those are also relative to the units. Those are fees that we collect to help pay for various pieces of hard infrastructure. So in their case, we have so much infrastructure to serve that area out there, we're expecting to get a certain amount of connection fees off of that user. We reduced and chose not to collect what they would be paying above and beyond what we'd normally expect because they're a heavy water user. We're still got, and for our users on our utility system, everything that we normally, maybe more than we normally would have gotten off of that same acreage for another typical industrial user on that. So the two breaks that they got was a break on their usage fee because of the economy of scale, and it's real. And we chose not to collect on another portion as an incentive to bring them to the community because of the benefit it provides to us in tax-based jobs and the benefit to the utility system, but we still collected what we normally would, so we weren't out anything. We just chose not to collect the extra, if that makes sense.
Tom, we do have one person with their hand raised online.
Okay, I'm gonna go to the person online because they deserve priority at this point. Jay, Renee's going to unmute you if you can ask your question then, please.
Yeah, I'd just like to hear a little more about the response if there's an interference or a quality issue. So I'm concerned about, a timely response. I'm assuming a little over 2.5 miles out, so I'd have to get a hold of the DNR. But if I have a water interference or a water quality issue, to me, that's sort of a emergency for a basic human need. And I'm gonna go ahead and call the appropriate contractor or contractors to, try to get them out there same day. So I guess, how do you anticipate this actually flowing? And what if there's a discrepancy as far as, the contractor tells me I need a new iron filter or whatever hardware it may be, or my my pump needs to be deeper, or whatever it is. I guess, how do you I want to hear more about the response and how you anticipate the flow of this actually realistically going. Who talks to who at what point?
So that's a really good, that's a good question. Rich did cover that, but it was part of the volume of information that he provided earlier tonight. So let me, I'll have Rich talk about process, but.
Let me jump in there and ask you this real quick. I heard all that part of it and I paid attention. But so what I'm confused about is you're saying that I would need to call the DNR, but who's gonna actually call the contractor to come out and do the assessment and do the work? And how's that gonna be in a timely manner? Because I believe that I would have to do that.
I think you heard that correctly. I think you said you're a little over 2.5 miles out, so you would not be subject to the city's response area for interference or for quality. So you'd be correct in calling your preferred contractor to address it as soon as possible. If you wished to submit that to the DNR and or city for review, we certainly would accept it. If it's 2.5 miles, we might ask the DNR to review it first. But we would also reserve the right to interview your contractor and talk about what was happened, what was necessary to try and get to the bottom of, was it really due to city pumping or something else? And if it was determined it was due to city pumping, we would take responsibility accordingly, along with working through it with the DNR staff, especially when that far. If you were closer in, it might be more of a city response initiative. But at 2.5 plus, you'd be right in calling your contractor first.
Yeah, it'll be very dependent upon the circumstances. So for example, you have a water outage, you call your contractor because you need to get back into water, but he finds out it wasn't well interference. It was, you had an issue with your drop pipe, you had an issue with the pump, there was an issue with the electrical. Those are things that clearly aren't a result. Interference issues are much easier because it's usually pretty self-evident. You're out of water, the contractor's gonna come out and fix it, and it'll be pretty easy to tell because either the water fell below the pump or there was an issue with the system itself. Water quality is a little bit more challenging because one, we have to tease out what the actual issue was and was it related to the city pumping. People will make the decisions they need to make, but I mean, I'll be blunt here, I don't wanna hide anything. If there was an issue and it could have been solved with just changing the filter and somebody made a snap decision to drop $6,000 on a brand new system that wasn't necessary to address what the actual issue was, we may look to reimburse for what the solution actually would have been required, not if somebody went above and beyond. But that's hard to say what exactly we would do because it's very dependent upon the circumstances, especially on a water quality item. Does that answer your question, Jay?
That does answer the question for the most part, but if you guys are going back and forth on sorting out the issue for months on end, and then you do determine it is due to the city's pumping in Niagara, then will that reimbursement include interest?
We'll reimburse for the cost to correct it because the assumption is if you're out of water, you have to get back in water one way or the other, and either it was us or it wasn't.
There are time limits in the permit, and I think we have to make reimbursement once the determination as to cause. I think it's 60 days we have to make that reimbursement. But
That's a good point. So if your question, Jay, is that this gets slow walked or gets drug around or there's a lot of mumbly jumbly and it takes 18 months, that's not going to happen. Once we arrive at the conclusion, it's a fairly straightforward process. Any follow-up on that, Jay? Or can we move on to the next question?
No follow-ups.
Okay. I'm going to go to Jonathan. He's been waiting patiently.
Yep, last question, asking for a family member that lives in the city. In the last newsletter, there's the Niagara insert, and then next to that was I think the watering restriction.
Yep.
Is there is Niagara gonna be participating in any form of restriction if it's dry and you start restricting city use of water?
So I know there's a difference of opinion. Use of water for their purpose is considered to be the same as use of water for other business purposes. It provides a consumable good, just like a car wash. The difference with regards to the watering restrictions is related to irrigation. Irrigation, especially for lawns, is considered to be the lowest on the priority list.
This is for
And
our kids' gardens, and they provide for their
and
whole
that's
community.
and it's still the same. Irrigation is towards the bottom of the list.
For food,
Yeah.
is it, Rich? Because they provide, both our son and daughter provide for their whole neighborhood, their gardens are big.
So
So they were wondering if.
So
if
our
they
watering
were gonna
restrictions are
do
odd
that.
even. It's not like you can't water, you just have to.
can't water
be
certain times. It
judicious
doesn't
about
even
it.
limit volume. You can choose when you water. You can water twice a day. You can water, and I do at my home. I water in the morning and then I water late in the evening, and thus it's roughly twice within a 2-day period. So it's not that they can't water. It's not that they're prevented from watering. It just restricts the time of day and limits it to odd even. But policy, state rules, statute, clearly there is a difference between production, Genio, Miller Lite, food production places, that's part of their production. Whether people want to view it that putting water in a bottle is the same as putting water on their lawn, it's not treated exactly the same way in policy.
This isn't a lawn, again, these are big, massive gardens that feed a ton of people in Elko.
Yep, and they can.
It's a produce for Elko.
So what I would ask them is to contact City Hall with the specific questions that they have related to their gardens, and then we can look at the ordinance and see how it would apply specifically to them. I'm always a little hesitant about, I'm asking a question for somebody who's not here because there's always the chance of telephone, so I would ask that they just call up to City Hall and then we can help them with that specific question related to their gardens.
Okay, good, because they're watching, so.
Yeah, and,
That's why.
yeah. Yes, sir.
We were talking about transparency and how this meeting is set up to be informational. And to my dismay,
when the time was critical to be informational with people was when the pump test was being done. That's bottom line. And I see public officials, their primary responsibility is for the public safety of their residents. So, if a city like Elko Newmarket sees that they might affect the water quality, even in a smidge of a doubt, the residents that are on wells, they should be notified. Or there should be some effort, even on social media. That's the lowest form of information. I did not see that. So when, my question is, when we're talking about in a few months, and we were given reassurances that we're gonna be slowly increasing the rates of water. Why was that said to us? Because I believe that's a reassurance that it won't affect the water quality or possibly well interference. But when it was most critical, and when we could have collected data that we could use to get the database, now we're relying on 20 individual well samples. That's my problem, and I feel like when we talk about public policy, public safety is number one. That's all I gotta say. Thank you, I don't even wanna answer.
Thank you.
So I will respond to that because it's legitimate. The question is, why didn't you know? So at no point in the process with the DNR did the DNR indicate that they expected this to happen. If they would have, we probably would have provided notice. They didn't expect it. Our experts didn't expect it. And as unfortunate as it is, we can't go back in time and change that. All we can do is address things going forward. So with that, Jared, unless you have a great question, or you, sir, I think we are done for the evening. Thank you very much.